Hello and welcome. My name's Joanne. Thank you for joining me today on Relax for a While, where we create space to unwind, relax, and escape into the beauty of a timeless story. Tonight I'll be narrating a few chapters from the timeless classic Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery, helping you relax and drift off into the charming world of Anne Shirley and the beautiful landscapes of Prince Edward Island. This is part 1 of a 3-part series, so be sure to return for the upcoming installments as we journey through this beloved classic together. If you enjoy soothing storytelling and relaxing bedtime content, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel and join my wonderful community. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. It really helps support the channel and brings more stories to those who need them. Before we dive into Anne's adventures, let's take a moment to relax and settle in with a calming visualization inspired by the beautiful, serene landscapes of Prince Edward Island. So let's take a moment now to get nice and cozy in our sleep space. Take a deep breath in and let it out slowly. Close your eyes if you'd like and allow your body to relax, softening into whatever surface is supporting you. Now imagine yourself in a wide open field, the soft grass swaying gently with the breeze. The air is fresh and clean, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers blooming around you. Rays of warm golden sunlight stream through the fluffy clouds above, creating dappled patterns of light on the ground. In the distance, you hear the gentle murmur of a brook as it winds its way through the countryside. Its sparkling waters flow peacefully over smooth stones, adding a soothing rhythm to the scene. A few birds sing in the trees nearby, their melodies weaving into the sounds of nature around you. Picture yourself walking slowly through this tranquil place. As you move, you feel a soft breeze brushing against your skin, carrying with it the earthy, sweet scents of the outdoors. The trees nearby sway gracefully, their leaves shimmering in the sunlight, and you notice tiny petals from wild blossoms floating gently down, decorating the ground with little pops of color. Take a moment to feel the stillness of this scene, as if time has paused just for you to soak in its beauty. With each breath, your day and any concerns fading away into the calmness of this peaceful place, filling your mind and body with calmness and relaxation. Take another deep breath in and let it out slowly. Give yourself permission to relax completely as we now step into the magical world of Anne of Green Gables. Chapter 1. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is Surprised. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow, fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops, and crossed by a brook that started far back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place. Early in its journey through the woods, the brook was known to be an intricate, headlong stream full of dark secrets of pools and cascades. But by the time it reached Lynde's Hollow, it had become a quiet, well-behaved little stream. Not even a brook could pass by Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without showing proper respect for decency and decorum. The brook likely knew that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed, from brooks to children. If she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had discovered the reasons for it. There were plenty of people in Avonlea and outside of it who could closely attend to their neighbors' business by neglecting their own. But Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable individuals who could manage her own concerns and those of others as well. She was a notable housewife. Her work was always done and done well. She ran the sewing circle, helped run the Sunday school, and was the strongest supporter of the Church Aid Society and Foreign Missions Auxiliary. Yet with all this, Mrs. Rachel found plenty of time to sit for hours at her kitchen window, knitting cotton warp quilts. She had knitted 16 of them, as Avonlea housekeepers would tell in odd voices, and keeping a sharp eye on the main road that crossed the hollow and wound up the steep red hill beyond. Since Avonlea occupied a little triangular peninsula jutting out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence with water on two sides, anyone who went out of it or into it had to pass over the hill road and so run the unseen scrutiny of Mrs. Rachel's all-seeing eye. One afternoon in early June, Mrs. Rachel Lynde was sitting by her window. The sun streamed in, warm and bright. The orchard on the slope below the house was in full bloom, a bridal flush of pinky white flowers. Thomas Lynde, a meek little man whom the people of Avonlea called Rachel Lynde's husband, was sowing his late turnip seed in the hill field beyond the barn. Matthew Cuthbert should have been sowing his turnip seed in the big red brook field over by Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel knew this because she had overheard him tell Peter Morrison the evening before in William J. Blair's store over at Carmody that he planned to sow his turnip seed the next afternoon. Peter had asked him, of course, since Matthew Cuthbert had never been known to volunteer information about anything in his entire life. And yet, here was Matthew Cuthbert, 3:30 on a busy afternoon, calmly driving over the hollow and up the hill. Moreover, he wore a white collar and his best suit, which clearly indicated he was leaving Avonlea. He had the buggy and the chestnut mare, suggesting he was going a considerable distance. Now, where was Matthew Cuthbert going, and why? Had it been any other man in Avonlea, Mrs. Rachel might have pieced together the clues and guessed fairly well. But Matthew so rarely left home that it had to be something pressing or unusual taking him away. He was the shyest man alive, and hated going among strangers or to any place where he might have to talk. Matthew, dressed up with a white collar and driving in a buggy, was a rare sight. Mrs. Rachel, ponder as she might, could make nothing of it, and her afternoon's enjoyment was spoiled. "I'll just step over to Green Gables after tea and find out from Marilla where he's gone and why," she finally concluded. He doesn't usually go to town at this time of year, and he never visits. If he'd run out of turnip seed, he wouldn't dress up and take the buggy to get more. He wasn't driving fast enough to be going for a doctor. Yet something must have happened since last night to set him off. I'm completely puzzled, and I won't have a minute's peace of mind until I know what has taken Matthew Cuthbert out of Avonlea today. After tea, Mrs. Rachel set out. She didn't have far to go. The big, rambling, orchard-embowered house where the Cuthberts lived was only a quarter of a mile up the road from Lynn's Hollow. To be sure, the long lane made it seem a bit farther. Matthew Cuthbert's father, as shy and silent as his son after him, had settled as far away as he possibly could from other people without actually retreating into the woods when he founded his homestead. Green Gables was built at the furthest edge of his cleared land, and there it remained to this day, barely visible from the main road, where all the other Avonlea houses were so sociably situated. Mrs. Rachel Lynde did not consider living in such a place living at all. "It's just staying, that's what," she said, as she walked along the deep, rutted, grassy lane bordered with wild rose bushes. "It's no wonder Matthew and Marilla are both a little odd, living back here by themselves. Trees aren't much company, though dear knows if they were, there'd be plenty of them. I'd rather look at people. To be sure, they seem content enough, but then I suppose they're used to it. A body can get used to anything, even to being hanged, as the Irishman said." With this, Mrs. Rachel stepped out of the lane into the backyard of Green Gables. The yard was very green, neat, and precise, flanked on one side by great patriarchal willows and on the other by prim Lombardy poplars. Not a stray stick or stone was to be seen, for Mrs. Rachel would have noticed if there had been. Privately, she believed Marilla Cuthbert swept that yard as often as she swept her house. One could have eaten a meal off the ground without exceeding the proverbial peck of dirt. Mrs. Rachel rapped smartly at the kitchen door and stepped in when invited. The kitchen at Green Gables was a cheerful room, or would have been cheerful if it weren't so painfully clean that it resembled an unused parlor. Its windows faced east and west. Through the west window, which looked out on the backyard, came a flood of mellow June sunlight. The east window, offering a glimpse of blooming white cherry trees in the left orchard and nodding. Slender birches down in the hollow by the brook was covered with a tangle of vines. Here sat Marilla Cuthbert when she sat at all, always slightly distrustful of sunshine, which seemed to her too lively and irresponsible for a world meant to be taken seriously. Here she sat now, knitting, and the table behind her was set for supper. Before she had fully closed the door, Mrs. Rachel had already taken mental note of everything on the table. 3 plates were laid, so Marilla must be expecting someone home with Matthew for tea, but the dishes were everyday ones, and there was only crabapple preserves and one kind of cake, so the expected company could not be anyone special. Yet what about Matthew's white collar and the chestnut mare? Mrs. Rachel was getting dizzy with this unusual mystery about quiet, unmysterious Green Gables. "Good evening, Rachel," Marilla said briskly. "This is a real fine evening, isn't it? Won't you sit down? How is everyone in your family?" Something that, for a lack of a better term, might be called friendship existed and always had existed between Marilla Cuthbert and Mrs. Rachel, despite, or perhaps because of, their dissimilarity. Marilla was a tall, thin woman with angles and without curves. Her dark hair showed some gray streaks, and was always twisted up in a hard little knot behind the 2 wire hairpins stuck aggressively through it. She looked like a woman of narrow experience and rigid conscience, which she was. But there was a saving something about her mouth which, if it had been ever so slightly developed, might have been considered indicative of a sense of humor. "We're all pretty well," said Mrs. Rachel. "I was kind of afraid you weren't, though, when I saw Matthew starting off today. I thought maybe he was going to the doctor's." Marilla's lip twitched understandingly. She had expected Mrs. Rachel to come up. She knew that the sight of Matthew jaunting off so unaccountably would be too much for her neighbor's curiosity. "Oh no, I'm quite well, although I had a bad headache yesterday," she said. "Matthew went to Bright River. We're getting a little boy from an orphan asylum in Nova Scotia, and he's coming on the train tonight." If Marilla had said that Matthew had gone to Bright River to meet a kangaroo from Australia, Mrs. Rachel could not have been more astonished. She was actually struck dumb for 5 seconds. It was unimaginable that Marilla was making fun of her, but Mrs. Rachel was almost forced to think so. "Are you serious, Marilla?" she demanded when her voice returned. "Yes, of course," said Marilla, as if getting boys from orphan asylums in Nova Scotia was part of the usual spring work on any well-regulated Avonlea farm, rather than an unheard-of innovation. Mrs. Rachel felt she had received a severe mental jolt. She thought in exclamation points. A boy! Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, of all people, adopting a boy from an orphan asylum. Well, the world was certainly turning upside down. She would be surprised at nothing after this. Nothing. "What on earth put such a notion into your head?" she demanded disapprovingly. This had been done without her advice being asked, and must therefore be disapproved. "Well, we've been thinking about it for some time. All winter, in fact," returned Marilla. "Mrs. Alexander Spencer was up here one day before Christmas, and she said she was going to get a little girl from the asylum over in Hopeton in the spring. Her cousin lives there, and Mrs. Spencer has visited her and knows all about it. So Matthew and I have talked it over off and on ever since. We thought we'd get a boy. Matthew's getting up in years, you know. He's 60, and he isn't as spry as he once was. His heart troubles him a good deal, and you know how desperately hard it's gotten to be to get hired help. There's never anybody to be had but those stupid, half-grown little French boys, and as soon as you get one broken into your ways and taught something, he's up and off to the lobster canneries or the States. At first, Matthew suggested getting a home boy, but I said no flat to that. They may be all right. I'm not saying they're not. Give me a native born at least. There'll be a risk no matter who we get, but I'll feel easier in my mind and sleep sounder at night if we get a born Canadian. So in the end, we decided to ask Mrs. Spencer to pick us out one when she went over to get her little girl. We heard last week she was going, so we sent word by Richard Spencer's folks at Carmody to bring us a smart, likely boy of about 10 or 11. We decided that would be the best age, old enough to be of some use in doing chores right off, and young enough to be trained up properly. We mean to give him a good home and schooling. We had a telegram from Mrs. Alexander Spencer today. The mailman brought it from the station, saying they were coming on the 5:30 train tonight. So Matthew went to Bright River to meet him. Mrs. Spencer will drop him off there. Of course, she goes on to White Sands Station herself. Mrs. Rachel prided herself on always speaking her mind. She proceeded to speak it now, having adjusted her mental attitude to this amazing piece of news. "Well, Marilla, I'll just tell you plainly that I think you're doing a mighty foolish thing. A risky thing, that's what. You don't know what you're getting. You're bringing a strange child into your house and home, and you don't know a single thing about him, nor what his disposition is like, nor what sorts of parents he had, nor how he's likely to turn out. Why, it was only last week I read in the paper how a man and his wife up west of the island took a boy out of an orphan asylum, and he set fire to the house at night. Set it on purpose, Marilla, and nearly burnt them to a crisp in their beds. And I know another case where an adopted boy used to suck the eggs. They couldn't break him of it. If you had asked my advice in the matter, which you didn't do, Marilla, I'd have said for mercy's sake not to think of such a thing. This job's comforting seemed neither to offend nor to alarm Marilla. She knitted steadily on. I don't deny there's something in what you say, Rachel. I've had some qualms myself. But Matthew was terribly set on it. I could see that, so I gave in. It's so seldom Matthew sets his mind on anything that when he does, I always feel it's my duty to give in. And as for the risk, there are risks in pretty near everything a body does in this world. There are risks in people having children of their own, if it comes to that. They don't always turn out well. And then Nova Scotia is right close to the island. It isn't as if we're getting him from England or the States. He can't be much different from ourselves. Well, I hope it will turn out all right, said Mrs. Rachel, in a tone that plainly indicated her painful doubts. Only don't say I didn't warn you. If he burns Green Gables down. I heard of a case over in New Brunswick where an orphan asylum child did that, and the whole family died in fearful agonies. Only it was a girl in that instance. Well, we're not getting a girl, said Marilla. I'd never dream of taking a girl to bring up. I wonder at Mrs. Alexander Spencer for doing it. But then she wouldn't shrink from adopting a whole orphan asylum if she took it into her head. Mrs. Rachel would have liked to stay until Matthew came home with his imported orphan, but reflecting that it would be a good 2 hours at least before his arrival, she decided to go up the road to Robert Bell's and tell the news. It would certainly make a sensation second to none, and Mrs. Rachel dearly loved to make a sensation. So she took herself away, somewhat to Marilla's relief, for the latter felt her doubts and fears reviving under the influence of Mrs. Rachel's pessimism. Well, of all things that ever were or will be, exclaimed Mrs. Rachel when she was safely out in the lane. It does really seem as if I must be dreaming. Well, I'm sorry for that poor young one, no mistake. Matthew and Marilla don't know anything about children, and they'll expect him to be wiser and steadier than his own grandfather, if he ever had a grandfather, which is doubtful. It seems uncanny to think of a child at Green Gables somehow. There's never been one there, for Matthew and Marilla were grown up when the new house was built. If there ever were children, which is hard to believe when one looks at them, I wouldn't be in that orphan's shoes for anything. My, but I pity him, that's what. Mrs. Rachel spoke to the wild rose bushes, expressing her heartfelt thoughts. But if she could have seen the child who was waiting patiently at the Bright River station at that very moment, her pity would have been even deeper and more profound. Chapter 2. Matthew Cuthbert is surprised. Matthew Cuthbert and his chestnut mare jogged comfortably over the 8 miles to Bright River. It was a picturesque road, winding between snug farmsteads, with occasional stretches of balsam fir woods to pass through, and hollows where wild plums displayed their delicate blooms. The air was fragrant with scent of numerous apple orchards, and the meadows sloped away into the distance, blending into horizon mists of pearl and purple. The little bird sang as if it were the one day of summer in all the year. Matthew enjoyed the drive in his own way, except for the moments when he encountered women and had to nod to them, for in Prince Edward Island it was customary to nod to everyone you met on the road, whether you knew them or not. Matthew dreaded all women except Marilla and Mrs. Rachel. He had an uneasy feeling that these mysterious creatures were secretly laughing at him. He might have been right, for he was an odd-looking person, with an ungainly figure, long iron-gray hair that touched his stooping shoulders, and a full, soft brown beard he had worn since he was 20. In fact, he had looked much the same at 20 as he did at 60, except for a bit more gray. When he reached Bright River, there was no sign of any train. He thought he was too early. He tied his horse in the yard of the small Bright River Hotel and went over to the station house. The long platform was almost deserted, with only a girl sitting on a pile of shingles at the far end. Matthew, barely noticing her, sidled past as quickly as possible without looking at her. Had he looked, he would have seen her tense rigidity and expectant expression. She was waiting for something or someone, and since waiting was all she could do at the moment, she did so with all her might. Matthew encountered the station master, who was locking up the ticket office and preparing to go home for supper. He asked if the 5:30 train would be soon along. "The 5:30 train has been in and gone half an hour ago," the brisk official answered. "But there was a passenger dropped off for you, a little girl. She's sitting out there on the shingles. I asked her to go into the ladies' waiting room, but she informed me gravely that she preferred to stay outside. There's more scope for imagination," she said. "She's quite a character, I must say." "I'm not expecting a girl," said Matthew blankly. "I came for a boy. He should be here. Mrs. Alexander Spencer was supposed to bring him over from Nova Scotia for me." The station master whistled. "Guess there's some mistake," he said. "Mrs. Spencer got off the train with that girl and put her in my charge. She said you and your sister were adopting her from an orphan asylum, and that you'd be along for her shortly. That's all I know about it, and I haven't got any more orphans hidden around here." "I don't understand," said Matthew helplessly, wishing Marilla was there to handle the situation. "Well, you'd better question the girl," the station master said carelessly. "I dare say she'll be able to explain. She's got a tongue of her own, that's certain. Maybe they were out of boys of the type you wanted." He walked jauntily away, eager for his supper, and the unfortunate Matthew was left to do what was harder for him than facing a lion in its den: approach a girl, a strange girl, an orphan girl, and ask her why she wasn't a boy. Matthew groaned inwardly as he turned and shuffled down the platform towards her. She had been watching him since he passed her, and she kept her eyes on him now. Matthew wasn't looking at her, and wouldn't have noticed her appearance even if he had, but an ordinary observer would have seen this: a child about 11, dressed in a very short, very tight, very ugly dress of yellowish-gray wincey. She wore a faded brown sailor hat, and beneath the hat, extending down her back, were 2 thick braids of decidedly red hair. Her face was small, white and thin, with many freckles. Her mouth was large, and so were her eyes, which looked green in some lights and gray in others. An ordinary observer might stop there, but an extraordinary observer might have noticed that her chin was very pointed and pronounced, that her big eyes were full of spirit and vivacity, that her mouth was sweet-lipped and expressive, and that her forehead was broad and full. In short, a discerning, extraordinary observer might have concluded that no ordinary soul inhabited the body of this stray child of whom shy Matthew Cuthbert was so ludicrously afraid. Matthew, however, was spared the ordeal of speaking first, for as soon as she realized he was coming to her, she stood up, grasping the handle of a shabby, old-fashioned carpet bag with one thin brown hand and holding out the other to him. "I suppose you're Mr. Matthew Cuthbert of Green Gables?" she said in a clear, sweet voice. "I'm very glad to see you. I was beginning to be afraid you weren't coming for me, and I was imagining all the things that might have happened to prevent you. I had made up my mind that if you didn't come for me tonight, I'd go down the track to that big wild cherry tree at the bend and climb up into it to stay all night. I wouldn't be a bit afraid, and it would be lovely to sleep in a wild cherry tree all white with bloom in the moonshine, don't you think? You could imagine you were dwelling in marble halls, couldn't you? And I was quite sure you would come for me in the morning if you didn't tonight." Matthew awkwardly took her scrawny little hand. Then and there he decided what to do. He couldn't tell this child with the glowing eyes that there had been a mistake. He would take her home and let Marilla handle it. She couldn't be left at Bright River anyway, no matter what mistake had been made. So all questions and explanations could wait until he was safely back at Green Gables. "I'm sorry I was late," he said shyly. "Come along. The horse is over in the yard. Give me your bag." "Oh, I can carry it," the child responded cheerfully. "It isn't heavy. I've got all my worldly goods in it, but it's not heavy. And if it isn't carried in just the right way, the handle pulls out, so I'd better keep it because I know exactly how to handle it. It's an extremely old carpet bag." "Oh, I'm very glad you've come, even though it would have been nice to sleep in a wild cherry tree. We have quite a journey ahead, don't we? Mrs. Spencer said it was 8 miles. I'm glad because I love traveling. Oh, it seems so wonderful that I'm going to live with you and belong to you. I've never belonged to anybody, not really. But the asylum was the worst. I've only been there 4 months, but that was enough. I don't suppose you've ever been in an orphan asylum, so you can't possibly understand what it's like. It's worse than anything you can imagine. Mrs. Spencer said it was wrong of me to talk like that, but I didn't mean to be bad. It's so easy to be bad without realizing it, isn't it? They were kind, you know, the people at the asylum, but there's so little room for imagination in an asylum. Only in the stories about the other orphans. It was quite fascinating to imagine things about them. To think maybe the girl next to you was really the daughter of a nobleman, stolen from her parents as a baby by a cruel nurse who died before confessing. I used to lie awake at night imagining such things because I didn't have time during the day. I suppose that's why I'm so thin. Am I terribly thin? There's hardly anything on my bones. I do love imagining myself plump and rosy with dimples in my elbows. With this, Matthew's companion stopped talking, partly because she was out of breath, and partly because they had reached the buggy. Not another word did she say until they had left the village and were driving down a steep little hill. The road had been cut deeply into the soft soil, with banks fringed by blooming wild cherry trees and slender white birches several feet above their heads. The child reached out and broke off a branch of wild plum that brushed against the side of the buggy. "Isn't that beautiful? What did that tree leaning up from the bank all white and lacy make you think of?" she asked. Well, now, I don't know, said Matthew. Why, a bride, of course. A bride all in white with a lovely misty veil. I've never seen one, but I can imagine what she would look like. I don't expect to be a bride myself. I'm so plain, nobody will ever want to marry me, unless maybe a foreign missionary. I suppose a foreign missionary wouldn't be very picky. But I do hope someday I'll have a white dress. That's my idea of earthly bliss. I just love pretty clothes. I've never had a pretty dress that I can remember, but that makes it all more exciting to look forward to, doesn't it? Then I can imagine myself dressed magnificently. This morning when I left the asylum, I felt so embarrassed because of this horrid old wincey dress. All the orphans had to wear them, you know. Last winter, a merchant in Hopeton donated 300 yards of wincey to the asylum. Some people said it was because he couldn't sell it, but I'd rather believe it was out of the goodness of his heart, wouldn't you? When we got on the train, I felt like everyone must be staring at me and feeling sorry for me, but I just pretended I was wearing the most beautiful pale blue silk dress, because when you're pretending, you might as well imagine something grand. And a big hat with flowers and waving feathers, a gold watch, kid gloves and boots. I felt cheered up right away and thoroughly enjoyed my trip to the island. I didn't feel a bit seasick on the boat. Neither did Mrs. Spencer, although she usually is. She said she didn't have time to get sick, watching to make sure I didn't fall overboard. She said she'd never seen anyone like me for prowling around, but if it kept her from being seasick, it was a good thing I was exploring, don't you think? I wanted to see everything there was to see on that boat, because I didn't know if I'd ever get another chance. Oh, there are more cherry trees in bloom. This island is the most blooming place. I already love it, and I'm so glad I'm going to live here. I've always heard Prince Edward Island was the prettiest place in the world, and I used to dream of living here, but I never really thought I would. It's wonderful when your dreams come true, isn't it? But those red roads are so strange. When we boarded the train at Charlottetown and the red roads started flashing past, I asked Mrs. Spencer why they were red. She said she didn't know, and for pity's sake not to ask any more questions. She said I must have asked 1,000 already. I suppose I did. But how else are you going to learn about things if you don't ask questions? What do you think makes the roads red? Well, now, I don't know, said Matthew. Well, that's one of the things to find out sometime. Isn't it splendid to think of all the things there are to discover? It just makes me feel so glad to be alive. It's such an interesting world. It wouldn't be half as interesting if we knew everything, would it? There'd be no room for imagination then, would there? But I'm talking too much. People always tell me I do. Would you rather I didn't talk? If you say so, I'll stop. I can stop when I make up my mind to it, though it's hard. Matthew, much to his surprise, found himself enjoying the conversation. Like most quiet folks, he liked talkative people when they did the talking themselves and didn't expect them to keep up, but he never expected to enjoy the company of a little girl. Women were so troublesome enough, but little girls were worse. He disliked the way they sidled past him timidly, with sidelong glances, as if they expected him to gobble them up if they spoke. That was the type of well-bred little girl in Avonlea. But this freckled witch was different, and though he found it a challenge for his slower mind to keep up with her quick mental pace, he found himself kind of liking her chatter. So he said as shyly as ever, "Oh, you can talk as much as you like. I don't mind." "Oh, I'm so glad. I know you and I are going to get along fine. It's such a relief to talk when you want to, and not be told that children should be seen and not heard. I've had that said to me 1,000,000 times if I have once. And people laugh at me because I use big words. But if you have big ideas, you have to use big words to express them, don't you? Well now, that sounds reasonable, said Matthew. Mrs. Spencer said my tongue must be hung in the middle, but it isn't. It's firmly fastened at one end. Mrs. Spencer said your place was named Green Gables. I asked her all about it, and she said there were trees all around it. I was gladder than ever. I just love trees. There weren't any at all around the asylum. Just a few poor little things out front with little whitewashed cages around them. They looked like orphans themselves, those trees did. It used to make me want to cry to look at them. I used to say to them, "Oh, you poor little things. If you were out in great big woods with other trees all around you, little mosses and June bells growing over your roots, a brook not far away, and birds singing in your branches, you could grow, couldn't you? But you can't where you are. I know just how you feel, little trees." I felt sorry to leave them behind this morning. You do get so attached to things like that, don't you? Is there a brook anywhere near Green Gables? I forgot to ask Mrs. Spencer that. Well now, yes, there's one right below the house. Imagine that. It's always been one of my dreams to live near a brook. I never thought I would, though. Dreams don't often come true, do they? Wouldn't it be nice if they did? But right now, I feel pretty nearly perfectly happy. I can't be exactly perfectly happy because, well, what color would you call this? She twitched one of her long, glossy braids over her thin shoulder and held it up before Matthew's eyes. Matthew wasn't used to deciding on the shade of ladies' hair, but in this case there couldn't be much doubt. It's red, ain't it? He said. The girl at the braid dropped down with a sigh that seemed to come from her very toes and to exhale forth all the sorrows of the ages. Yes, it's red, she said resignedly. Now you see why I can't be perfectly happy. Nobody could be with red hair. I don't mind the other things so much, the freckles and the green eyes and my skinniness. I can imagine them away. I can imagine I have a beautiful rose-leaf complexion and lovely starry violet eyes. But I can't imagine away this red hair. I do my best. I think to myself, now my hair is a glorious black, black as the raven's wing. But all the time I know it's just plain red, and it breaks my heart. It will be my lifelong sorrow. I read of a girl once in a novel who had a lifelong sorrow, but it wasn't red hair. Her hair was pure gold rippling back from her alabaster brow. What is an alabaster brow? I can never find out. Can you tell me? Well now, I'm afraid I can't, said Matthew, who was getting a little dizzy. He felt as he had once felt in his rash youth, when another boy had enticed him onto a merry-go-round at a picnic. Well, whatever it was, it must have been something nice because she was divinely beautiful. Have you ever imagined what it must feel like to be divinely beautiful? Well now, no, I haven't, confessed Matthew ingenuously. I have, often. Which would you rather be if you had a choice? Divinely beautiful, dazzling clever, or angelically good? Well now, I don't know exactly. Neither do I. I can never decide. But it doesn't make much real difference, for it isn't likely I'll ever be any of them. It's certain I'll never be angelically good. Mrs. Spencer says, "Oh, Mr. Cuthbert." That was not what Mrs. Spencer had said. Neither had the child tumbled out of the buggy, nor had Matthew done anything remarkable. They had simply rounded a bend in the road and found themselves on the avenue. The avenue, as it was called by the Newbridge people, was a stretch of road 400 or 500 yards long, completely arched with huge, wide-spreading apple trees planted years ago by an eccentric old farmer. Overhead was one long canopy of snowy, fragrant bloom. Beneath the boughs, the air was filled with a purple twilight, and far ahead, a glimpse of painted sunset sky gleamed like a great rose window at the end of a cathedral aisle. Its beauty seemed to leave the child speechless. She leaned back in the buggy, her thin hands clasped before her, her face lifted rapturously to the white splendor above. Even as they passed through and descended the long slope to Newbridge, she did not move or speak. She continued in silence through Newbridge, a bustling village where dogs barked, small boys jeered, and curious faces peered from windows. When another 3 miles had slipped by, the child still hadn't spoken. She could keep silence as energetically as she could talk. "I guess you're feeling pretty tired and hungry?" Matthew ventured to say at last, accounting for her long silence with the only reason he could think of. "But we haven't far to go now, just another mile." She came out of her reverie with a deep sigh and a look at him with the dreamy gaze of a soul that had been wandering far, led by stars. "Oh, Mr. Cuthbert," she whispered, "that place we passed through, that white place, what was it?" "Well now, you must mean the avenue," said Matthew after a few moments of profound reflection. "It's a sort of pretty place." "Pretty? Oh, pretty doesn't seem the right word, nor beautiful either. They don't go far enough." "Oh, it was wonderful, wonderful. It's the first thing I ever saw that couldn't be made better by imagination. It just satisfies me here." She placed a hand on her chest. "It made a strange, pleasant ache. Did you ever have an ache like that, Mr. Cuthbert?" "Well now, I can't say that I have." "I feel that way a lot, whenever I see something really beautiful. But calling that lovely place the Avenue doesn't seem right. It needs a name that fits its magic, like the White Way of Delight. When I don't like a name for something or someone, I always imagine a new one, and think of them that way. At the asylum, there was a girl named Hepzibah Jenkins, but I always imagined her as Rosalia DeVere. Others may call it Avenue, but I'll always call it the White Way of Delight. Are we really just 1 mile away from home now? I'm glad and sad. I'm sad because this drive has been so nice, and I hate when pleasant things end. Sometimes what comes after isn't as nice. It's been my experience. But I'm happy thinking about going home. I haven't had a real home that I can remember. It gives me that nice ache again, just thinking about a true home. Oh, isn't that beautiful?" They had driven over a hilltop. Below them lay a pond, so long and winding it looked almost like a river. A bridge crossed it midway, and from there to its lower end, where sand dunes of amber color enclosed it from the deep blue sea beyond, the water shimmered in many shifting hues. Shades of crocus, rose, and green, with other elusive colors that had no name. Above the bridge, the pond extended into groves of fir and maple, its surface dark and translucent under their flickering shadows. Occasionally, a wild plum leaned over the bank, like a girl in white reaching towards her reflection. From the marsh at the pond's head came the mournfully sweet chorus of frogs. A small gray house peeked through a white apple orchard on a slope beyond, and although it was not yet fully dark, a light shone from one of its windows. That's Barry's Pond, said Matthew. Oh, I don't like that name either. I'll call it, let me think, the Lake of Shining Waters. Yes, that's the right name. I know because it gives me a thrill. When I find a name that fits perfectly, it thrills me. Do things ever give you a thrill? Matthew thought for a moment. Well, now, yes. I always get a thrill when I see those ugly white grubs digging in the cucumber beds. I can't stand the sight of them. Oh, I don't think that's quite the same kind of thrill, do you? Grubs and lakes of shining waters don't seem connected at all, do they? But why do other people call it Barry's Pond? I suppose because Mr. Barry lives up there in that house. His place is called Orchard Slope. If it wasn't for that big bush behind it, you could see Green Gables from here, but we have to go over the bridge and around by the road, so it's almost half a mile further. Does Mr. Barry have any little girls? Well, not very little, about my size. He has one who's about 11. Her name is Diana. Oh, she drew in a long breath. What a perfectly lovely name. Well, now, I don't know. It seems a bit unusual to me. I'd prefer Jane or Mary or some sensible name like that. But when Diana was born, there was a schoolmaster staying there, and he named her Diana. I wish there had been a schoolmaster like that around when I was born. Oh, here we are at the bridge. I'm going to close my eyes tight. I'm always scared when I go over bridges. I imagine that maybe just as we reach the middle, it might collapse like a jackknife and crush us. So I close my eyes, but I always have to open them when I think we're near the middle, because if the bridge did collapse, I'd want to see it happen. What a wonderful rumble it makes. I do love the rumble part. Isn't it amazing that there are so many things to love in this world? There, we're over. Now I'll look back. Good night, dear lake of shining waters. I always say good night to things I love, just like I would to people. I think they like it. That water looks like it's smiling at me. As they drove up the next hill and around a bend, Matthew said, We're almost home now. Green Gables is just... Oh, don't tell me, she interrupted eagerly, catching his arm and shutting her eyes so she wouldn't see his gesture. Let me guess. I'm sure I'll guess right. She opened her eyes and looked around. They were on top of a hill. The sun had set some time ago, but the landscape was still clear in the soft afterglow. To the west, a dark church spire rose against a sky of marigold. Below them lay a small valley, and beyond that, a long, gently rising slope with cozy farms scattered along it. The child's eyes darted eagerly from one to another, wistful and eager. Finally, they settled on one farm to the left, set back from the road, faintly glowing with blossoming trees in the twilight of the surrounding woods. Above it, in the clear southwestern sky, a large crystal white star shone like a guiding and promising lamp. That's it, isn't it? She exclaimed, pointing. Matthew flicked the reins on the mare's back with joy. Well now, you guessed it, but I suppose Mrs. Spencer described it so you could tell. No, she didn't. Really, she didn't. All she said could have been about most of those other places. I didn't have a real idea of what it looked like, but as soon as I saw it, I knew it was home. Oh, it feels like I must be dreaming. You know, my arm must be black and blue from pinching myself so many times today. Every now and then, a horrible sickening feeling would come over me, and I was so afraid it was all a dream. Then I'd pinch myself to see if it was real, and suddenly I remembered that even if it was just a dream, I should keep dreaming as long as I could, so I stopped pinching. But it's real, and we're almost home." With a sigh of delight, she fell silent. Matthew fidgeted uneasily. He was glad that it would be Marilla, not he, who would have to tell this wanderer from the world that the home she longed for was not to be hers after all. They drove past Lynn's Hollow, where it was already quite dark, but not so dark that Mrs. Rachel could not see them from her window perch, up the hill, and into the long lane leading to Green Gables. By the time they reached the house, Matthew was shrinking from the impending revelation with an energy he did not understand. It wasn't Marilla or himself he was worried about, or the trouble this mistake might cause them, but the disappointment the child would feel. When he thought about that light of anticipation being extinguished in her eyes, he felt an uncomfortable sensation, similar to when he had to slaughter a lamb or calf or any other innocent little creature. The yard was dark as they turned into it, and the poplar leaves rustled softly all around. "Listen to the trees talking in their sleep," she whispered, gripping tightly to the carpet bag that held all her worldly goods as he helped her down from the carriage. "They must have such nice dreams." Then she followed him into the house. Chapter 3. Marilla Cuthbert is Surprised. Marilla walked briskly forward as Matthew opened the door, but when her eyes landed on the odd little figure in the stiff, ugly dress with the long braids of red hair and the eager bright eyes, she stopped short in amazement. "Matthew Cuthbert, who is that?" she exclaimed. "Where is the boy?" "There wasn't any boy," said Matthew, clearly upset. "There was only her." He nodded at the child, realizing he hadn't even asked her name. "No boy? But there must have been a boy," insisted Marilla. "We told Mrs. Spencer to bring a boy." "Well, she didn't. She brought her. I asked the station master, and I had to bring her home. She couldn't be left there, no matter where the mix-up happened." "Well, this is a fine mess," exclaimed Marilla. During this conversation, the child had remained silent, her eyes darting from one to the other, all the excitement draining from her face. Suddenly, she seemed to grasp the full meaning of what had been said. Dropping her precious carpet bag, she sprang forward a step and clasped her hands. "You don't want me," she cried. "You don't want me because I'm not a boy. I should have expected this. Nobody ever wants me. I should have known it was all too good to be true. I should have known nobody really did want me. Oh, what shall I do? I'm going to cry." And cry she did, sitting down on a chair by the table, flinging her arms out upon it, and burying her face in them, she cried stormily. Marilla and Matthew looked at each other helplessly across the stove. Neither of them knew what to say or do. Finally, Marilla stepped in awkwardly. Well, there's no need to cry so much about it." "Yes, there is." The child raised her head quickly, revealing a tear-stained face and trembling lips. "You would cry too if you were an orphan and had come to a place you thought was going to be home and found that they didn't want you because you weren't a boy. Oh, this is the most tragic thing that ever happened to me." Something like a reluctant smile, rather rusty from long disuse, softened Marilla's grim expression. "Well, don't cry any more. We're not going to turn you out tonight. You'll have to stay here until we investigate this matter. What's your name?" The child hesitated for a moment. "Will you please call me Cordelia?" she said eagerly. Call you Cordelia? Is that your name? No, it's not exactly my name, but I would love to be called Cordelia. It's such a perfectly elegant name. I don't know what on earth you mean. If Cordelia isn't your name, what is? Anne Shirley, reluctantly admitted the girl. But, oh, please do call me Cordelia. It can't matter much to you what you call me, if I'm only going to be here a little while, can it? And Anne is such an unromantic name. Unromantic nonsense, said the unsympathetic Marilla. Anne is a real good, plain, sensible name. You've no need to be ashamed of it. Oh, I'm not ashamed of it, explained Anne. Only I like Cordelia better. I've always imagined that my name was Cordelia. At least I always have in recent years. When I was younger, I used to imagine it was Geraldine, but I like Cordelia better now. But if you call me Anne, please call me Anne spelled with an E. What difference does it make how it's spelled? Asked Marilla, with another rusty smile as she picked up the teapot. Oh, it makes such a difference. It looks so much nicer. When you hear a name pronounced, can't you always see it in your mind, just as if it were printed out? I can. And A-N-N looks dreadful, but A-N-N-E looks so much more distinguished. If you'll only call me Anne spelled with an E, I shall try to reconcile myself to not being called Cordelia. Very well, then. Anne spelled with an E, can you tell us how this mistake happened? We sent word to Mrs. Spencer to bring us a boy. Were there no boys at the asylum? Oh, yes, there were plenty of them. But Mrs. Spencer said distinctly that you wanted a girl about 11 years old. And the matron said she thought I would do. You don't know how delighted I was. I couldn't sleep all last night for joy. Oh, she added reproachfully, turning to Matthew. Why didn't you tell me at the station that you didn't want me and leave me there? If I hadn't seen the White Way of Delight and the Lake of Shining Waters, it wouldn't be so hard. What on earth does she mean? Demanded Marilla, staring at Matthew. She's just referring to some conversation we had on the road, said Matthew hastily. I'm going out to put the mare in, Marilla. Have tea ready when I come back. Did Mrs. Spencer bring anybody else besides you? Continued Marilla after Matthew had gone out. She brought Lily Jones for herself. Lily is only 5 years old, and she's very beautiful and has nut-brown hair. If I were very beautiful and had nut-brown hair, would you keep me? No, we wanted a boy to help Matthew on the farm. A girl would be of no use to us. Take off your hat. I'll put it and your bag on the hall table. Anne took off her hat meekly. Matthew came back presently, and they sat down to supper. But Anne could not eat. She nibbled at the bread and butter, and pecked at the crab-apple preserve out of the little scalloped dish by her plate, but she didn't really make any progress at all. You're not eating anything, said Marilla sharply, eyeing her as if it were a serious fault. Anne sighed. I can't. I'm in the depths of despair. Can you eat when you're in the depths of despair? I've never been in the depths of despair, so I can't say, responded Marilla. Really? Well, have you ever tried to imagine you were in the depths of despair? No, I haven't. Then I don't think you can understand what it's like. It's a very uncomfortable feeling. When you try to eat, a lump comes right up in your throat and you can't swallow anything, not even if it was a chocolate caramel. I had a chocolate caramel once 2 years ago, and it was simply delicious. I've often dreamed since then that I had a lot of chocolate caramels, but I always wake up just when I'm about to eat them. I do hope you won't be offended because I can't eat. Everything's very nice, but still, I cannot eat. "I guess she's tired," said Matthew, who hadn't spoken since his return from the barn. "Best put her to bed, Marilla." Marilla had been wondering where Anne should sleep. She had prepared a couch in the kitchen chamber for the expected boy, but although it was neat and clean, it did not seem right to put a girl there. However, the spare room was out of question for such a stray child, so there remained only the East Gable room. Marilla lit a candle and told Anne to follow her, which Anne did, taking her hat and carpet bag from the hall table as she passed. The hall was fearsomely clean. The little gable chamber where she soon found herself seemed even cleaner. Marilla set the candle on a three-legged, three-cornered table and turned down the bedclothes. "I suppose you have a nightgown?" she asked. Anne nodded. "Yes, I have two. The matron of the asylum made them for me. They're very skimpy. There is never enough to go round in an asylum, so things always get skimpy, at least in a poor asylum like ours. I hate skimpy nightdresses, but one can dream just as well in them as in lovely trailing ones with frills around the neck. That's one consolation. Well, undress as quick as you can and go to bed. I'll come back in a few minutes for the candle. I don't trust you to put it out yourself. You'd likely set the place on fire." When Marilla had gone, Anne looked around her wistfully. The whitewashed walls were so painfully bare and stark that she thought they must ache over their own emptiness. The floor was bare, too, except for a round braided mat in the middle, something Anne had never seen before. In one corner was the bed, a high, old-fashioned one, with 4 dark, low-turned posts. In the other corner was the small 3-cornered table adorned with a fat, red velvet pincushion hard enough to turn the point of the most adventurous pin. Above it hung a small 6x8 mirror. Midway between the table and bed was the window, with an icy white muslin frill over it, and opposite was the washstand. The whole room was so rigid and unwelcoming, it sent a shiver to the very marrow of Anne's bones. With a sob, she hastily discarded her garments, put on the skimpy nightgown, and sprang into bed, where she burrowed face down into the pillow and pulled the covers over her head. When Marilla came up for the light, various skimpy articles of clothing were scattered untidily over the floor, and the bed had a certain tempestuous appearance. These were the only indications that Anne was there. Marilla deliberately picked up Anne's clothes, placed them neatly on a prim yellow chair, and then, taking up the candle, went over to the bed. "Good night," she said, a little awkwardly, but not unkindly. Anne's white face and big eyes appeared over the bedclothes with startling suddenness. "How can you call it a good night when you know it must be the very worst night I've ever had?" she said reproachfully. Then she dived down into invisibility again. Marilla went slowly down to the kitchen and proceeded to wash the supper dishes. Matthew was smoking, a sure sign of a troubled mind. He seldom smoked, for Marilla considered it a filthy habit. But at certain times he felt driven to it, and then Marilla tolerated the practice, realizing that a man must have some outlet for his emotions. "Well, this is a fine mess," she said wrathfully. "This is what comes of sending word instead of going ourselves. Richard Spencer's folks have twisted that message somehow. One of us will have to drive over and see Mrs. Spencer tomorrow, that's certain. This girl will have to be sent back to the asylum." "Yes, I suppose so," said Matthew reluctantly. "You suppose so? Don't you know it?" "Well now, she's a real nice little thing, Marilla, It's kind of a pity to send her back when she's so set on staying here." "Matthew Cuthbert, you don't mean to say you think we ought to keep her?" Marilla's astonishment could not have been greater if Matthew had expressed a desire to stand on his head. "Well, now, no, I suppose not. Not exactly," stammered Matthew, uncomfortably cornered for his precise meaning. "I suppose we could hardly be expected to keep her." "I should say not. What good would she be to us?" "We might be some good to her," said Matthew suddenly and unexpectedly. "Matthew Cuthbert, I believe that child has bewitched you. I can see as plain as day that you want to keep her." "Well now, she's a really interesting little thing," persisted Matthew. "You should have heard her talk on the way from the station." "Oh, she can talk fast enough. I saw that at once. It's nothing in her favor either. I don't like children who have so much to say. I don't want an orphan girl, and if I did, she isn't the type I'd pick. There's something about her I don't understand. No, she's got to be sent straight back to where she came from." "I could hire a French boy to help me," said Matthew, "and she'd be company for you." "I'm not suffering for company," said Marilla shortly, "and I'm not going to keep her." "Well now, it's just as you say, of course, Marilla," said Matthew, rising and putting his pipe away. "I'm going to bed." To bed went Matthew, and to bed, when she had put the dishes away, went Marilla, frowning most resolutely. And upstairs, in the east gable, a lonely, heart-hungry, friendless child cried herself to sleep. Chapter 4. Morning at Green Gables. It was broad daylight when Anne awoke and sat up in bed, staring confusedly at the window through which a flood of cheerful sunshine was pouring. Outside, something white and feathery waved across glimpses of blue sky. For a moment, she could not remember where she was. First came a delightful thrill, as if something very pleasant, then a horrible realization. This was Green Gables, and they did not want her because she wasn't a boy. But it was morning and, yes, it was a cherry tree in full bloom outside her window. With a bound, she was out of bed and across the floor. She pushed up the sash. It went up stiffly and creakily, as if it hadn't been opened for a long time, which was the case, and it stuck so tightly that nothing was needed to hold it up. Anne dropped to her knees and gazed out into the June morning, her eyes glistening with delight. Oh, wasn't it beautiful? Wasn't it a lovely place? Suppose she wasn't really going to stay here. She would imagine she was. There was scope for imagination here. A huge cherry tree grew outside, so close that its branches tapped against the house, and it was so thick with blossoms that hardly a leaf was to be seen. On both sides of the house was a big orchard, one of apple trees and one of cherry trees, also showered with blossoms. And the grass was all sprinkled with dandelions. In the garden below were lilac trees, purple with flowers, and their dizzying sweet fragrance drifted up to the window on the morning wind. Below the garden, a green field lush with clover sloped down to the hollow where the brook ran and where scores of white birches grew, upspringing airily out of an undergrowth, suggestive of delightful possibilities in ferns, mosses, and woodsy things generally. But it was a hill, green and feathery with spruce and fir. There was a gap in it, where the gray gable end of the little house she had seen from the other side of the lake of shining waters was visible. Off to the left were the big barns, and beyond them, Away down over green, low-sloping fields was a sparkling blue glimpse of the sea. Anne's beauty-loving eyes lingered on it all, taking everything in greedily. She had looked on so many unlovely places in her life, poor child, but this was as lovely as anything she had ever dreamed. She knelt there, lost to everything but the loveliness around her, until she was startled by a hand on her shoulder. Marilla had come in unheard by the small dreamer. "It's time you were dressed," she said curtly. Marilla really did not know how to talk to the child, and her uncomfortable ignorance made her crisp and curt when she did not mean to be. Anne stood up and drew a long breath. "Oh, isn't it wonderful?" she said, waving her hand comprehensively at the good world outside. "It's a big tree," said Marilla, "and it blooms great, but the fruit doesn't amount to much, small and wormy." "Oh, I don't mean just the tree. Of course it's lovely. Yes, it's radiantly lovely. It blooms as if it meant it. But I meant everything. The garden and the orchard and the brook and the woods. The whole big dear world. Don't you feel as if you just loved the world on a morning like this? And I can hear the brook laughing all the way up here. Have you ever noticed what cheerful things brooks are? They're always laughing. Even in the winter time I've heard them under the ice. I'm so glad there's a brook near Green Gables. Perhaps you think it doesn't make any difference to me when you're not going to keep me, but it does. I shall always like to remember that there is a brook at Green Gables, even if I never see it again. If there wasn't a brook, I'd be haunted by the uncomfortable feeling that there ought to be one. I'm not in the depths of despair this morning. I never can be in the morning. Isn't it a splendid thing that there are mornings? But I feel very sad. I've just been imagining that it was really me you wanted after all, and that I was to stay here forever and ever. It was a great comfort while it lasted. But the worst of imagining things is that the time comes when you have to stop, and that hurts. You'd better get dressed and come downstairs, and never mind your imaginings, said Marilla, as soon as she could get a word in edgewise. Breakfast is waiting. Wash your face and comb your hair. Leave the window up, and turn your bedclothes back over the foot of the bed. Be as smart as you can. Anne could evidently be smart to some purpose, for she was downstairs in 10 minutes, with her clothes neatly on, her hair brushed and braided, her face washed, and a comfortable consciousness pervading her soul that she had fulfilled all Marilla's requirements. As a matter of fact, however, she had forgotten to turn back the bedclothes. "I'm pretty hungry this morning," she announced, as she slipped into the chair Marilla placed for her. "The world doesn't seem such a howling wilderness as it did last night. I'm so glad it's a sunny morning, but I like rainy mornings real well, too. All sorts of mornings are interesting, don't you think? You don't know what's going to happen through the day, and there's so much scope for imagination. But I'm glad it's not rainy today, because it's easier to be cheerful and bear up under affliction on a sunny day. I feel that I have a good deal to bear up under. It's all very well to read about sorrows and imagine yourself living through them heroically, but it's not so nice when you really come to have them, is it?" "For pity's sake, hold your tongue," said Marilla. "You talk entirely too much for a little girl." Thereupon, Anne held her tongue so obediently and thoroughly that her continued silence made Marilla rather nervous, as if in the presence of something not exactly natural. Matthew also held his tongue, but this was natural, so the meal was a very silent one. As it progressed, Anne became more and more abstracted, eating mechanically, with her big eyes fixed unswervingly and unseeingly on the sky outside the window. This made Marilla more nervous than ever. She had an uncomfortable feeling that while this odd child's body might be at the table, her spirit was far away in some remote airy cloudland, borne aloft on the wings of imagination. Who would want such a child about the place? Yes, Matthew wished to keep her, of all unaccountable things. Marilla felt that he wanted it just as much this morning as he had the night before, and that he would go on wanting it. That was Matthew's way. Take a whim into his head and cling to it with the most amazing silent persistence. A persistence 10 times more potent and effective in its very silence than if he had talked it out. When the meal ended, Anne came out of her reverie and offered to wash the dishes. "Can you wash dishes properly?" asked Marilla distrustfully. "Pretty well. I'm better at looking after children, though. I've had so much experience at that. It's such a pity you haven't any here for me to look after." "I don't feel as if I wanted any more children to look after than I've got at present. You're problem enough in all conscience. What's to be done with you, I don't know. Matthew is a most ridiculous man." "I think he's lovely," said Anne reproachfully. "He's so very sympathetic. He didn't mind how much I talked. He seemed to like it. I felt that he was a kindred spirit as soon as I ever saw him." "You're both queer enough, if that's what you mean by kindred spirit," said Marilla with a sniff. "Yes, you may wash the dishes. Take plenty of hot water, and be sure you dry them well. I've got enough to attend to this morning, for I'll have to drive over to White Sands in the afternoon and see Mrs. Spencer. You'll come with me, and we'll settle what's to be done with you. After you finish the dishes, go upstairs and make your bed." Anne washed the dishes deftly enough, as Marilla, who kept a sharp eye on the process, discerned. Later on, she made her bed less successfully, for she had never learned the art of wrestling with a feather tick. But it was done somehow and smoothed down. Then Marilla, to get rid of her, told her she might go outdoors and amuse herself until dinner time. Anne flew to the door, face alight, eyes glowing. On the very threshold, she stopped short, turned around, came back and sat down by the table. Light and glow, as effectively blotted out as if someone had clapped an extinguisher on her. "What's the matter now?" demanded Marilla. "I don't dare go out," said Anne, in the tone of a martyr relinquishing all earthly joys. "If I can't stay here, there is no use in my loving Green Gables. And if I go out there and get acquainted with all those trees and flowers, and the orchard and the brook, I'll not be able to help loving it. It's hard enough now, so I won't make it any harder. I want to go out so much. Everything seems to be calling to me. Anne, Anne, come out to us. Anne, Anne, we want a playmate. But it's better not. There is no use in loving things if you have to be torn from them, is there? And it's so hard to keep from loving things, isn't it? That was why I was so glad when I thought I was going to live here. I thought I'd have so many things to love and nothing to hinder me. But that brief dream is over. I'm resigned to my fate now, so I don't think I'll go out for fear I'll get unresigned again. What is the name of that geranium on the windowsill, please?" "That's the apple-scented geranium." "Oh, I don't mean that sort of name. I mean just a name you gave it yourself. Didn't you give it a name? May I give it one then? May I call it, let me see. Bonnie would do. May I call it Bonnie while I'm here? Oh, do let me." "Goodness, I don't care. But where on earth is the sense of naming a geranium?" "Oh, I like things to have names, even if they are only geraniums. It makes them seem more like people. How do you know but that it hurts a geranium's feelings just to be called a geranium and nothing else? You wouldn't like to be called nothing but a woman all the time, Yes, I shall call it Bonnie. I named the cherry tree outside my bedroom window this morning. I called it Snow Queen because it was so white. Of course it won't always be in blossom, but one can imagine that it is, can't one? I never in all my life saw or heard anything to equal her, muttered Marilla, retreating to the cellar for potatoes. She is kind of interesting, as Matthew says. I can feel already that I'm wondering what on earth she'll say next. She'll be casting a spell over me, too. She's cast it over Matthew. That look he gave me when he went outside said everything he said or hinted last night all over again. I wish he was like other men and would talk things out. Then a person could answer back and argue him into reason. But what's to be done with a man who just looks? Anne had relapsed into reverie, with her chin in her hands and her eyes on the sky, when Marilla returned from her cellar trip. There Marilla left her until the early dinner was on the table. I suppose I can have the mare and buggy this afternoon, Matthew, said Marilla. Matthew nodded and looked wistfully at Anne. Marilla intercepted the look and said grimly, I'm going to drive over to White Sands and settle this thing. I'll take Anne with me, and Mrs. Spencer will probably make arrangements to send her back to Nova Scotia at once. I'll set your tea out for you, and I'll be home in time to milk the cows. Still, Matthew said nothing, and Marilla had a sense of having wasted words and breath. There is nothing more aggravating than a man who won't talk back, unless it is a woman who won't. Matthew hitched the sorrel into the buggy in due time, and Marilla and Anne set off. Matthew opened the yard gate for them, and as they drove slowly through, he said to nobody in particular as it seemed, Little Jerry Buote from the creek was here this morning, and I told him I guessed I'd hire him for the summer. Marilla made no reply, but she hit the unlucky sorrel such a vicious clip with the whip that the fat mare, unused to such treatment, whizzed indignantly down the lane at an alarming pace. Marilla looked back once as the buggy bounced along and saw that aggravating Matthew leaning over the gate, looking wistfully after them. Chapter 5. Anne's History. Do you know, said Anne confidentially, I've made up my mind to enjoy this drive. It's been my experience that you can nearly always enjoy things if you firmly decide that you will. Of course, you must make the decision firmly. I am not going to think about going back to the asylum while we're having our drive. I'm just going to focus on enjoying the drive. Oh, look, there's one little early wild rose out. Isn't it lovely? Don't you think it must be glad to be a rose? Wouldn't it be nice if roses could talk? I'm sure they could tell us such lovely things. And isn't pink the most enchanting color in the world? I love it, but I can't wear it. Red-headed people can't wear pink, not even in their imagination. Did you ever know of anybody whose hair was red when she was young, but changed color when she grew up? No, I don't know as I ever did, said Marilla mercilessly, and I shouldn't think it likely to happen in your case either. Anne sighed. Well, that's another hope gone. My life is a perfect graveyard of buried hopes. That's a sentence I read in a book once, and I say it to comfort myself whenever I'm disappointed in anything. I don't see where the comfort comes in myself, said Marilla. Why, because it sounds so nice and romantic, just as if I were a heroine in a book, you know. I'm so fond of romantic things, and a graveyard full of buried hopes is about as romantic as one can imagine, isn't it? I'm rather glad I have one. Are we going across the lake of shining waters today? We're not going over Barry's Pond, if that's what you mean by your lake of shining waters. We're going by the shore road." "Shore road sounds nice," said Anne dreamily. "Is it as nice as it sounds?" Just when you said shore road, I saw it in a picture in my mind as quick as that. And White Sands is a pretty name too, but I don't like it as well as Avonlea. Avonlea is a lovely name. It sounds like music. How far is it to White Sands?" "It's 5 miles, and since you're evidently bent on talking, you might as well talk to some purpose by telling me what you know about yourself." "Oh, what I know about myself isn't really worth telling," said Anne eagerly. "If you'll only let me tell you what I imagine about myself, you'll find it ever so much more interesting." "No, I don't want any of your imaginings. Just stick to the facts. Begin at the beginning. Where were you born and how old are you?" "I was 11 last March," said Anne, resigning herself to the facts with a little sigh. "And I was born in Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia. My father's name was Walter Shirley, and he was a teacher in Bolingbroke High School. My mother's name was Bertha Shirley. Aren't Walter and Bertha lovely names? I'm so glad my parents had nice names. It would be a real disgrace to have a father named, well, say, Jedediah, wouldn't it?" "I guess it doesn't matter what a person's name is, as long as he behaves himself," said Marilla, feeling the need to impart a good and useful moral. "Well, I don't know." Anne looked thoughtful. "I read in a book once that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but I've never been able to believe it. I don't think a rose would be as nice if it was called a thistle or a skunk cabbage. I suppose my father could have been a good man, even if he had been called Jedediah, but I'm sure it would have been a burden. Well, my mother was a teacher in the high school too, but when she married father, she gave up teaching, of course. A husband was enough responsibility. Mrs. Thomas said they were a pair of babies and as poor as church mice. They went to live in a tiny little yellow house in Bolingbroke. I've never seen that house, but I've imagined it thousands of times. I think it must have had honeysuckle over the parlor window, lilacs in the front yard, and lilies of the valley just inside the gate. Yes, and muslin curtains in all the windows. Muslin curtains give a house such an air. I was born in that house. Mrs. Thomas said I was the homeliest baby she ever saw. I was so scrawny and tiny and nothing but eyes, but Mother thought I was perfectly beautiful. I should think a mother would be a better judge than a poor woman who came in to scrub, wouldn't you? I'm glad she was satisfied with me anyway. I would feel so sad if I thought I was a disappointment to her, because she didn't live very long after that. She died of fever when I was just 3 months old. I do wish she'd lived long enough for me to remember calling her mother. I think it would be so sweet to say mother, don't you? And father died 4 days afterwards, from fever too. That left me an orphan, and folks didn't know what to do with me. Nobody wanted me even then. It seems to be my fate. Father and mother had both come from places far away, and it was well known they hadn't any relatives living. Finally, Mrs. Thomas said she'd take me, though she was poor and had a drunken husband. She brought me up by hand. Do you know if there is anything in being brought up by hand that ought to make people better than others? Because whenever I was naughty, Mrs. Thomas would ask me how I could be such a bad girl when she had brought me up by hand. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas moved away from Bolingbroke to Marysville, and I lived with them until I was 8 years old. I helped look after the Thomas children. There were 4 of them, younger than me, and they took a lot of looking after. Then Mr. Thomas was killed, falling under a train, and his mother offered to take Mrs. Thompson and the children, but she didn't want me. Mrs. Thompson didn't know what to do with me. Then Mrs. Hammond, from up the river, came down and said she'd take me, seeing I was handy with children, and I went up the river to live with her in a little clearing among the stumps. It was a very lonesome place. I'm sure I could never have lived there if I hadn't had an imagination. Mr. Hammond worked a little sawmill up there, and Mrs. Hammond had 8 children. She had twins 3 times. I like babies in moderation, but twins 3 times in succession is too much. I told Mrs. Hammond so firmly when the last pair came. I used to get so dreadfully tired carrying them about. I lived upriver with Mrs. Hammond over 2 years, and then Mr. Hammond died, and Mrs. Hammond broke up housekeeping. She divided her children among her relatives and went to the States. I had to go to the asylum at Hopeton because nobody would take me. They didn't want me at the asylum either. They said they were overcrowded as it was, but they had to take me, and I was there 4 months until Mrs. Spencer came. Anne finished up with another sigh, this time of relief. Evidently, she did not like talking about her experiences in a world that had not wanted her. "Did you ever go to school?" asked Marilla, turning the sorrel mare down the shore road. "I didn't go to school much. I went a little during the last year I stayed with Mrs. Thomas. When I went up the river, we were so far from a school that I couldn't walk there in the winter, and there was a vacation in summer, so I could only go in the spring and fall. But of course, I went while I was at the asylum. I can read pretty well, and I know ever so many pieces of poetry by heart. The Battle of Hohenlinden, Edinburgh after Flodden, Bingen of the Rhine, and most of The Lady of the Lake and The Seasons by James Thomson. Don't you just love poetry that gives you a crinkly feeling up and down your back? There's a piece in the 5th Reader, The Downfall of Poland, that is just full of thrills. Of course, I wasn't in the 5th Reader. I was only in the 4th, but the big girls used to lend me theirs to read." "Were those women, Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Hammond, good to you?" asked Marilla, looking at Anne out of the corner of her eye. "Oh," faltered Anne. Her sensitive little face suddenly flushed scarlet, and embarrassment sat on her brow. "Oh, they meant to be. I know they meant to be just as good and kind as possible. And when people mean to be good to you, you don't mind very much when they're not quite always. They had a good deal to worry about, you know. It's very trying to have a drunken husband, you see, and it must be very trying to have twins 3 times in succession, don't you think? But I feel sure they meant to be good to me." Marilla asked no more questions. Anne gave herself up to a silent rapture over the shore road, and Marilla guided the sorrel mare abstractedly while she pondered deeply. Pity was suddenly stirring in her heart for the child. What a starved, unloved life she had had, a life of drudgery, poverty, and neglect. For Marilla was shrewd enough to read between the lines of Anne's history and divine the truth. No wonder she'd been so delighted at the prospect of a real home. It was a pity she had to be sent back. What if she, Marilla, should indulge Matthew's unaccountable whim and let her stay? He was set on it, and the child seemed a nice, teachable little thing. She's got too much to say, thought Marilla, but she might be trained out of that. And there's nothing rude or slangy in what she does say. She's ladylike. It's likely her people were nice folks. The shore road was woodsy and wild and lonesome. On the right hand, scrub firs, their spirits quite unbroken by long years of tussle with the Gulf winds, grew thickly. On the left were the steep red sandstone cliffs, so near the track in places that a mare of less steadiness than the sorrel might have tried the nerves of the people behind her. Down at the base of the cliffs were heaps of surf-worn rocks, or little sandy coves inlaid with pebbles as with ocean jewels. Beyond lay the sea, shimmering in blue, and over it soared the gulls, their wings flashing silvery in the sunlight. "Isn't the sea wonderful?" said Anne, rousing from a long, wide-eyed silence. "Once, when I lived in Marysville, Mr. Thomas hired an express wagon and took us all to spend the day at the shore 10 miles away. I enjoyed every moment of that day, even if I had to look after the children all the time. I lived it over in happy dreams for years, but this shore is nicer than the Marysville shore. Aren't those gulls splendid? Would you like to be a gull? I think I would. That is, if I couldn't be a human girl. Don't you think it would be nice to wake up at sunrise and swoop down over the water and away out over the lovely blue all day, and then at night to fly back to one's nest? Oh, I can just imagine myself doing it. What big house is that just ahead, please?" "That's the White Sands Hotel. Mr. Kirk runs it, but the season hasn't begun yet. There are heaps of Americans who come here for the summer. They think this shore is just about perfect." "I was afraid it might be Mrs. Spencer's place," said Anne mournfully. "I don't want to get there. Somehow it will seem like the end of everything." Chapter 6. Marilla Makes Up Her Mind. They did get there, however, in due time. Mrs. Spencer lived in a big yellow house at White Sands Cove. She came to the door with surprise and welcome mingled on her kindly face. "Dear, dear," she exclaimed, "you're the last folks I expected today, but I'm real glad to see you. Will you put your horse in? And how are you, Anne?" "I'm as well as can be expected, thank you," said Anne without a smile. A shadow seemed to have fallen over her. "I suppose we'll stay a little while to rest the mare," said Marilla. "But I promised Matthew I'd be home early. The fact is, Mrs. Spencer, there's been a queer mistake somewhere, and I've come over to find out what it is. We sent word, Matthew and I, for you to bring us a boy from the asylum. We told your brother Robert to tell you we wanted a boy 10 or 11 years old." "Marilla Cuthbert, you don't say so," said Mrs. Spencer in distress. "Why, Robert sent word down by his daughter Nancy, and she said you wanted a girl. Didn't she, Flora Jane?" she asked her daughter, who had come out to the steps. "She certainly did, Miss Cuthbert," confirmed Flora Jane earnestly. "I'm dreadfully sorry," said Mrs. Spencer. "It's too bad, but it certainly wasn't my fault, you see, Miss Cuthbert. I did the best I could and thought I was following your instructions. Nancy is a terribly flighty thing. I've often had to scold her for her carelessness." "It was our own fault," said Marilla resignedly. "We should have come to you ourselves and not left an important message to be passed along by word of mouth. Anyway, the mistake has been made, and the only thing to do is set it right. Can we send the child back to the asylum? I suppose they'll take her back, won't they?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Spencer thoughtfully, "but I don't think it will be necessary to send her back. Mrs. Peter Blewett was here yesterday, and she mentioned how much she wished she'd sent for a little girl to help her. Mrs. Peter has a large family, you know, and she finds it hard to get help. Anne would be the perfect girl for her. I call it positively providential." Marilla did not look as if she thought Providence had much to do with the matter. Here was an unexpectedly good chance to get this unwelcome orphan off her hands, and she didn't even feel grateful for it. She knew Mrs. Peter Blewett only by sight as a small, sharp-faced woman without an ounce of extra flesh on her bones, but she had heard of her. A terrible worker and driver, Mrs. Peter was said to be, and discharged servant girls told fearsome tales of her temper and stinginess and her family of pert, quarrelsome children. Marilla felt a pang of conscience at the thought of handing Anne over to her care. "Well, I'll go in and we'll talk the matter over," she said. "And if there isn't Mrs. Peter Blewett coming up the lane this very minute," exclaimed Mrs. Spencer, bustling her guest through the hall into the parlor. The room felt as if the air had been strained through dark, green, closely drawn blinds, losing every bit of warmth it ever had. "That is really lucky, for we can settle the matter right away. Take the armchair, Miss Cuthbert. Anne, you sit here on the ottoman and don't wiggle. Let me take your hats. Flora Jane, go out and put the kettle on." "Good afternoon, Mrs. Blewett. We were just saying how fortunate it was that you came by. Let me introduce you two ladies, Mrs. Blewett, Miss Cuthbert. Please excuse me for just a moment. I forgot to tell Flora Jane to take the buns out of the oven." Mrs. Spencer whisked away after pulling up the blinds. Anne, sitting mutely on the ottoman with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stared at Mrs. Blewett as if fascinated. Was she to be given into the care of this sharp-faced, sharp-eyed woman? She felt a lump rising in her throat, and her eyes smarted painfully. She was beginning to fear she couldn't keep the tears back when Mrs. Spencer returned, flushed and beaming, ready to handle any difficulty, physical, mental, or spiritual. "It seems there's been a mistake about this little girl, Mrs. Blewett," she said. "I was under the impression that Mr. and Miss Cuthbert wanted a little girl to adopt. I was certainly told so. But it seems it was a boy they wanted. So if you're still of the same mind you were yesterday, I think she'll be just the thing for you." Mrs. Blewett darted her eyes over Anne from head to foot. "How old are you and what's your name?" she demanded. "Anne Shirley," faltered the shrinking child, not daring to make any stipulations regarding the spelling, "and I'm 11 years old." You don't look as if there was much to you, but you're wiry." "I don't know, but the wiry ones are the best after all." "Well, if I take you, you'll have to be a good girl, you know, good and smart and respectful. I'll expect you to earn your keep, and no mistake about that. Yes, I suppose I might as well take her off your hands, Miss Cuthbert. The baby's awful fractious, and I'm clean worn out attending to him. If you like, I can take her right home now." Marilla looked at Anne and softened at the sight of the child's pale face with its look of mute misery, the misery of a helpless little creature who finds itself once more caught in the trap from which it had escaped. Marilla felt an uncomfortable conviction that, if she denied the appeal of that look, it would haunt her to her dying day. Moreover, she did not fancy Mrs. Blewett. To hand a sensitive, high-strung child over to such a woman. No, she could not take the responsibility of doing that. "Well, I don't know," she said slowly. "I didn't say that Matthew and I had absolutely decided we wouldn't keep her. In fact, I may say that Matthew is disposed to keep her. I just came over to find out how the mistake had occurred. I think I'd better take her home again and talk it over with Matthew. I feel that I oughtn't to decide on anything without consulting him. If we make up our mind not to keep her, we'll bring or send her over to you tomorrow night. If we don't, you may know that she's going to stay with us. Will that suit you, Mrs. Blewett?" "I suppose it'll have to," said Mrs. Blewett ungraciously. During Marilla's speech, a sunrise had been dawning on Anne's face. First, the look of despair faded out. Then came a faint flush of hope. Her eyes grew deep and bright as morning stars. The child was quite transfigured, and a moment later, When Mrs. Spencer and Mrs. Blewett went out in search of a recipe the latter had come to borrow, she sprang up and flew across the room to Marilla. "Oh, Miss Cuthbert, did you really say that perhaps you would let me stay at Green Gables?" she said in a breathless whisper, as if speaking aloud might shatter the glorious possibility. "Did you really say it, or did I only imagine that you did?" "I think you'd better learn to control that imagination of yours, Anne, if you can't distinguish between what is real and what isn't," said Marilla crossly. "Yes, you did hear me say just that and no more. It isn't decided yet, and perhaps we will conclude to let Mrs. Blewett take you after all. She certainly needs you more than I do." "I'd rather go back to the asylum than to go live with her," said Anne passionately. "She looks exactly like a gimlet." Marilla smothered a smile under the conviction that Anne must be reproved for such a speech. "A little girl like you should be ashamed of talking so about a lady and a stranger," she said severely. "Go back and sit down quietly and hold your tongue and behave as a good girl should." "I'll try to do and be anything you want me to, if you'll only keep me," said Anne, returning meekly to her ottoman. When they arrived back at Green Gables that evening, Matthew met them in the lane. Marilla, from afar, had noted him prowling along it and guessed his motive. She was prepared for the relief she read in his face when he saw that she had at least brought Anne back with her, but she said nothing to him about the affair until they were both out in the yard behind the barn, milking the cows. Then she briefly told him Anne's history and the result of the interview with Mrs. Spencer. "I wouldn't give a dog I liked to that Blewett woman," said Matthew with unusual vigor. "I don't fancy her style myself," admitted Marilla. "But it's that or keeping her ourselves, Matthew. And since you seem to want her, I suppose I'm willing, or have to be. I've been thinking over the idea until I've got kind of used to it. It seems a sort of duty. I've never brought up a child, especially a girl, and I dare say I'll make a terrible mess of it, but I'll do my best. So far as I'm concerned, Matthew, she may stay." Matthew's shy face glowed with delight. "Well now, I reckoned you'd come to see it that way, Marilla," he said. "She's such an interesting little thing." "It'd be more to the point if you could say she was a useful little thing," retorted Marilla. "But I'll make it my business to see she's trained to be that. And mind, Matthew, you're not to go interfering with my methods. Perhaps an old maid doesn't know much about bringing up a child, but I guess she knows more than an old bachelor, so you just leave me to manage her. When I fail, it'll be time enough to put your oar in." There, Marilla, you can have your own way," said Matthew reassuringly. "Only be as good and kind to her as you can without spoiling her. I kind of think she's one of the sort you can do anything with if you only get her to love you." Marilla sniffed to express her contempt for Matthew's opinions concerning anything feminine and walked off to the dairy with the pails. "I won't tell her tonight that she can stay," she reflected as she strained the milk into the creamers. "She'd be so excited that she wouldn't sleep a wink. Marilla Cuthbert, you're fairly in for it. Did you ever suppose you'd see the day when you'd be adopting an orphan girl? It's surprising enough, but not so surprising as that Matthew should be at the bottom of it, him that always seemed to have such a mortal dread of little girls. Anyhow, we've decided on the experiment, and goodness only knows what will come of it." Chapter 7. Anne Says Her Prayers. When Marilla took Anne up to bed that night, she said stiffly, "Now, Anne, I noticed last night that you threw your clothes all over the floor when you took them off. That is a very untidy habit, and I can't allow it at all. As soon as you take off any article of clothing, fold it neatly and place it on the chair. I have no use for little girls who aren't neat. I was so upset last night that I didn't think about my clothes at all, said Anne. I'll fold them nicely tonight. They always made us do that at the asylum. Half the time, though, I'd forget because I'd be in such a hurry to get into bed and imagine things. You'll have to remember a little better if you stay here, admonished Marilla. There, that looks better. Say your prayers now and get into bed. I never say any prayers, announced Anne. Marilla looked horrified. Why, Anne, what do you mean? Were you never taught to say your prayers? God always wants little girls to say their prayers. Don't you know who God is, Anne? God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth, responded Anne promptly and glibly. Marilla looked rather relieved. So you do know something, thank goodness. Where did you learn that? Oh, at the Asylum Sunday School. They made us learn the whole catechism. I liked it pretty well. There's something splendid about some of the words. Infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. Isn't that grand? It has a roll to it, just like a big organ playing. You couldn't quite call it poetry, I suppose, but it sounds a lot like it, doesn't it? We're not talking about poetry, Anne. We're talking about saying your prayers. Don't you know it's a terribly wicked thing not to say your prayers every night? I'm afraid you're a very bad little girl. You'd find it easier to be bad than good if you had red hair, said Anne reproachfully. People who haven't red hair don't know what trouble is. Mrs. Thomas told me that God made my hair red on purpose, and I've never cared about him since. And anyway, I'd always be too tired at night to bother saying prayers. People who have to look after twins can't be expected to say their prayers. Now, do you honestly think they can? Marilla decided that Anne's religious training must begin at once. Clearly, there was no time to be lost. You must say your prayers while you're under my roof, Anne. Why, of course, if you want me to, agreed Anne cheerfully. I'd do anything to oblige you. But you'll have to tell me what to say for this once. After I get into bed, I'll imagine a real nice prayer to say always. I believe it will be quite interesting now that I think about it. You must kneel down, said Marilla, feeling awkward. Anne knelt at Marilla's knee and looked up gravely. Why must people kneel down to pray? If I really wanted to pray, I'll tell you what I'd do. I'd go out into a big field all alone, or into the deep, deep woods, and I'd look up into the sky, up, 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 into that lovely blue sky that looks as if there was no end to its blueness. And then I'd just feel a prayer. Well, I'm ready. What am I to say? Marilla felt more awkward than ever. She'd intended to teach Anne the simple, "Now I lay me down to sleep." But it suddenly occurred to her that this simple little prayer, sacred to white-robed childhood, was entirely unsuited to this freckled girl, who knew and cared nothing about God's love, since she had never experienced human love. You're old enough to pray for yourself, Anne, she said finally. Just thank God for your blessings and ask him humbly for the things you want. Well, I'll do my best, promised Anne, burying her face in Marilla's lap. Graciously Heavenly Father. That's the way the ministers say it in church, so I suppose it's all right in private prayer, isn't it? She interjected, lifting her head for a moment. Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank Thee for the white way of delight and the lake of shining waters and Bonnie and the Snow Queen. I'm really extremely grateful for them. And that's all the blessings I can think of just now to thank thee for. As for the things I want, they're so numerous that it would take a great deal of time to name them all, so I will only mention the two most important. Please let me stay at Green Gables, and please let me be good-looking when I grow up. I remain, yours respectfully, Anne Shirley. There, did I do all right? She asked eagerly, getting up. I could have made it much more flowery if I had a little more time to think it over. Poor Marilla was only preserved from complete collapse by remembering that it was not irreverence, but simply spiritual ignorance on Anne's part that was responsible for this extraordinary petition. She tucked the child up in bed, mentally vowing that she would teach her a proper prayer the very next day, and was leaving the room with the light when Anne called her back. I've just thought of it now. I should have said amen instead of yours respectfully, shouldn't I? The way the ministers do. I'd forgotten it, but I felt a prayer shouldn't be finished off in some way, so I put in the other. Do you suppose it will make any difference? I don't suppose it will, said Marilla. Go to sleep now like a good child. Good night. I can only say good night tonight with a clear conscience, said Anne, cuddling luxuriously down among her pillows. Marilla retreated to the kitchen, set the candle firmly on the table, and glared at Matthew. Matthew Cuthbert, it's about time somebody adopted that child and taught her something. Will you believe that she never said a prayer in her life until tonight? I'll send her to the manse tomorrow and borrow the Peep of the Day series. That's what I'll do. And she'll go to Sunday school just as soon as I can get some suitable clothes made for her. I foresee that I shall have my hands full. Well, we can't get through this world without our share of trouble. I've had a pretty easy life so far, but my time has come at last, and I suppose I'll just have to make the best of it. Chapter 8. Anne's bringing up is begun. For reasons best known to herself, Marilla did not tell Anne that she was to stay at Green Gables until the next afternoon. During the morning, she kept the child busy with various tasks and watched over her with a keen eye while she did them. By noon, she had concluded that Anne was smart and obedient, willing to work and quick to learn. Her most serious shortcoming seemed to be a tendency to fall into daydreams in the middle of a task and forget all about it until such time as she was sharply recalled to earth by a reprimand or a catastrophe. When Anne had finished washing the dinner dishes, she suddenly confronted Marilla with the air and expression of one desperately determined to learn the worst. Her thin little body trembled from head to foot. Her face flushed, and her eyes dilated until they were almost black. She clasped her hands tightly and said in an imploring voice, "Oh, please, Miss Cuthbert, won't you tell me if you're going to send me away or not? I've tried to be patient all morning, but I really feel that I cannot bear not knowing any longer. It's a dreadful feeling. Please tell me." "You haven't scalded the dishcloth in clean hot water as I told you to do," said Marilla immovably. "Just go and do it before you ask any more questions, Anne." Anne went and attended to the dishcloth. Then she returned to Marilla and fastened imploring eyes on the latter's face. "Well," said Marilla, unable to find any excuse for deferring her explanation longer, "I suppose I might as well tell you. Matthew and I have decided to keep you. That is, if you will try to be a good girl and show yourself grateful." "Why, child, whatever is the matter?" "I'm crying," said Anne in a tone of bewilderment. "I can't think why. I'm glad as glad can be." Oh, glad doesn't seem the right word at all. I was glad about the white way and the cherry blossoms, but this, oh, it's something more than glad. I'm so happy. I'll try to be so good. It will be uphill work, I expect, for Mrs. Thomas often told me I was desperately wicked. However, I'll do my very best. But can you tell me why I'm crying? I suppose it's because you're all excited and worked up, said Marilla disapprovingly. Sit down on that chair and try to calm yourself. I'm afraid you both cry and laugh far too easily. Yes, you can stay here, and we will try to do right by you. You must go to school, but it's only a fortnight till vacation, so it isn't worth starting before it opens again in September. What am I to call you? Asked Anne. Shall I always say Miss Cuthbert? Can I call you Aunt Marilla? No, you'll call me just plain Marilla. I'm not used to being called Miss Cuthbert, and it would make me nervous. It sounds awfully disrespectful to just say Marilla, protested Anne. I guess there'll be nothing disrespectful in it if you're careful to speak respectfully. Everybody, young and old in Avonlea, calls me Marilla except the minister. He says Miss Cuthbert when he thinks of it. I'd love to call you Aunt Marilla, said Anne wistfully. I've never had an aunt or any relation at all, not even a grandmother. It would make me feel as if I really belonged to you. Can't I call you Aunt Marilla? No, I'm not your aunt, and I don't believe in calling people names that don't belong to them. But we could imagine you were my aunt. I couldn't, said Marilla grimly. Do you never imagine things different from what they really are? Asked Anne, wide-eyed. No. Oh, Anne drew a long breath. Oh, Miss Marilla, how much you miss. I don't believe in imagining things different from what they really are, retorted Marilla. When the Lord puts us in certain circumstances, He doesn't mean for us to imagine them away. And that reminds me, go into the sitting room, Anne. Be sure your feet are clean and don't let any flies in, and bring me out the illustrated card that's on the mantelpiece. The Lord's Prayer is on it, and you'll devote your spare time this afternoon to learning it by heart. There's to be no more of such praying as I heard last night. I suppose I was very awkward, said Anne apologetically. But then, you see, I'd never had any practice. You couldn't really expect a person to pray very well the first time she tried, could you? I thought out a splendid prayer after I went to bed, just as I promised you I would. It was nearly as long as a minister's and so poetical. But would you believe it? I couldn't remember one word when I woke up this morning, and I'm afraid I'll never be able to think out another one as good. Somehow, things never are as good when they're thought out a second time. Have you ever noticed that? Here is something for you to notice, Anne. When I tell you to do a thing, I want you to obey me at once and not stand still and talk about it. Just go and do as I tell you. Anne properly departed for the sitting room across the hall. She failed to return. After 10 minutes, Marilla laid down her knitting and marched after her with a grim expression. She found Anne standing motionless before a picture hanging on the wall between the two windows, with her eyes filled with dreams. The white and green light, filtered through apple trees and clustering vines outside, fell over the rapt little figure with half an unearthly radiance. Anne, what are you thinking of? Demanded Marilla sharply. Anne came back to earth with a start. That, she said, pointing to the picture. A rather vivid chromo entitled Christ Blessing Little Children. And I was just imagining I was one of them, that I was the little girl in the blue dress, standing off by herself in the corner, as if she didn't belong to anybody, like me. She looks lonely and sad, don't you think? I guess she hadn't any father or mother of her own, but she wanted to be blessed too, so she just crept shyly up on the outside of the crowd, hoping nobody would notice her, except him. I'm sure I know just how she felt. Her heart must have beat, and her hands must have got cold, like mine did when I asked you if I could stay. She was afraid he might not notice her. But it's likely he did, don't you think? I've been trying to imagine it all out. Her edging a little nearer all the time until she was quite close to him. And then he would look at her and put his hand over her hair, and oh, such a thrill of joy as would run over her. But I wish the artist hadn't painted him so sorrowful looking. All his pictures are like that, if you've noticed. I don't believe he could really have looked so sad, or the children would have been afraid of him. Anne, said Marilla, wondering why she had not broken into the speech long before. You shouldn't talk that way. It's irreverent, positively irreverent. Anne's eyes marveled. Why, I felt just as reverent as could be. I'm sure I didn't mean to be irreverent. Well, I don't suppose you did, but it doesn't sound right to talk so familiarly about such things. And another thing, Anne, when I send you after something, you're to bring it at once and not fall into daydreaming in front of pictures. Remember that. Take that card and come right to the kitchen. Now, sit down in the corner and learn that prayer by heart. Anne set the card up against the jug full of apple blossoms she had brought in to decorate the dinner table, propped her chin on her hands, and fell to studying it intently for several silent minutes. I like this, she announced at length. It's beautiful. I've heard it before. I heard the superintendent of the asylum Sunday school say it over once, but I didn't like it then. He had such a cracked voice, and he prayed it so mournfully. I really felt sure he thought praying was a disagreeable duty. This isn't poetry, but it makes me feel just the same way poetry does. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That is just like a line of music. Oh, I'm so glad you thought of making me learn this, Miss Marilla. Well, learn it and hold your tongue, said Marilla shortly. Anne tipped the vase of apple blossoms close enough to bestow a soft kiss on a pink-cupped bud, and then studied diligently for some moments longer. Marilla, she demanded presently, do you think I shall ever have a bosom friend in Avonlea? What kind of friend? A bosom friend. An intimate friend, you know. A really kindred spirit to whom I can confide my inmost soul. I've dreamed of meeting her all my life. I never really supposed I would, but so many of my loveliest dreams have come true all at once that perhaps this one will too. Do you think it's possible? Diana Barry lives over at Orchard Slope, and she's about your age. She's a very nice little girl, and perhaps she'll be a playmate for you when she comes home. She's visiting her aunt over at Carmody just now. You'll have to be careful how you behave yourself, though. Mrs. Barry is a very particular woman. She won't let Diana play with any little girl who isn't nice and good. Anne looked at Marilla through the apple blossoms, her eyes aglow with interest. What is Diana like? Her hair isn't red, is it? Oh, I hope not. It's bad enough to have red hair myself, but I positively couldn't endure it in a bosom friend. Diana's a very pretty little girl. She has black eyes and hair and rosy cheeks, and she is good and smart, which is better than being pretty. Marilla was as fond of morals as the Duchess in Wonderland, and was firmly convinced that one should be tacked on to every remark made to a child who was being brought up. But Anne waved the moral aside and seized only on the delightful possibilities before her. Oh, I'm so glad she's pretty. Next to being beautiful oneself, and that's impossible in my case, it would be best to have a beautiful bosom friend. When I lived with Mrs. Thomas, she had a bookcase in her sitting room with glass doors. There weren't any books in it. Mrs. Thomas kept her best china and preserves there, when she had any preserves to keep. One of the doors was broken. Mr. Thomas smashed it one night when he was slightly intoxicated. But the other was whole, and I used to pretend that my reflection in it was another little girl who lived in it. I called her Katie Maurice, and we were very intimate. I used to talk to her for hours, especially on Sundays, and tell her everything. Katie was the comfort and consolation of my life. We used to pretend that the bookcase was enchanted, and that if I only knew the spell, I could open the door and step right into the room where Katie Maurice lived, instead of into Mrs. Thomas's shelves of preserves and china. And then Katie Maurice would have taken me by the hand and led me out into a wonderful place, all flowers and sunshines and fairies, and we would have lived there happily ever after. When I went to live with Mrs. Hammond, it just broke my heart to leave Katie Maurice. She felt it dreadfully, too. I know she did, for she was crying when she kissed me goodbye through the bookcase door. There was no bookcase at Mrs. Hammond's, but just up the river, a little way from the house, there was a long green valley, and the loveliest echo lived there. It echoed back every word you said, even if you didn't talk a bit loud. So I imagined that it was a little girl called Violetta, and we were great friends, and I loved her almost as well as I loved Katie Maurice. Not quite, but almost, you know. The night before I went to the asylum, I said goodbye to Violetta, and oh, her goodbye came to me in such sad, sad tones. I had become so attached to her that I hadn't the heart to imagine a bosom friend at the asylum, even if there had been any scope for imagination there. I think it's just as well there wasn't, said Marilla dryly. I don't approve of such goings-on. You seem to half believe your own imaginations. It will be well for you to have a real-life friend to put such nonsense out of your head. But don't let Mrs. Barry hear you talking about your Katie Maurices and your Violettas, or she'll think you tell stories. Oh, I won't. I couldn't talk of them to everybody. Their memories are too sacred for that. But I thought I'd like to have you know about them. Oh, look, here's a big bee just tumbled out of an apple blossom. Just think what a lovely place to live, in an apple blossom. Fancy going to sleep in it when the wind was rocking it. If I wasn't a human girl, I think I'd like to be a bee and live among the flowers. Yesterday you wanted to be a seagull, sniffed Marilla. I think you are very fickle-minded. I told you to learn that prayer and not talk. But it seems impossible for you to stop talking if you've got anybody that will listen to you. So go up to your room and learn it. Oh, I know it pretty nearly all now, all but just the last line. Well, never mind. Do as I tell you. Go to your room and finish learning it well, and stay there until I call you down to help me get tea. Can I take the apple blossoms with me for company? Pleaded Anne. No, you don't want your room cluttered up with flowers. You should have left them on the tree in the first place. I did feel a little that way too, said Anne. I kind of felt I shouldn't shorten their lovely lives by picking them. I wouldn't want to be picked if I were an apple blossom, but the temptation was irresistible. What do you do when you meet with an irresistible temptation? Anne, did you hear me tell you to go to your room? Anne sighed, retreated to the east gable, and sat down in a chair by the window. There, I know this prayer. I learned that last sentence coming upstairs. Now I'm going to imagine things into this room so that they always stay imagined. The floor is covered with a white velvet carpet with pink roses all over it, and there are pink silk curtains at the windows. The walls are hung with gold and silver brocade tapestry. The furniture is mahogany. I've never seen any mahogany, but it sounds so luxurious. This is a couch all heaped with gorgeous silken cushions, pink and blue and crimson and gold, and I'm reclining gracefully on it. I can see my reflection in that splendid big mirror hanging on the wall. I am tall and regal, clad in a gown of trailing white lace, with a pearl cross on my breast and pearls in my hair. My hair is of midnight darkness, and my skin is a clear ivory pallor. My name is Lady Cordelia Fitzgerald. No, it isn't. I can't make that seem real. She danced up to the little looking-glass and peered into it. Her pointed, freckled face and solemn gray eyes peered back at her. You're only Anne of Green Gables, she said earnestly, and I see you just as you're looking now whenever I try to imagine I'm the Lady Cordelia. But it's a million times nicer to be Anne of Green Gables than Anne of nowhere in particular, isn't it? She bent forward, kissed her reflection affectionately, and betook herself to the open window. Dear Snow Queen, good afternoon, and good afternoon, dear birches down in the hollow, and good afternoon, dear gray house up on the hill. I wonder if Diana is to be my bosom friend. I hope she will, and I shall love her very much, but I must never quite forget Katie, Maurice, and Violetta. They would feel so hurt if I did, and I'd hate to hurt anybody's feelings, even a little bookcase girl's or a little echo girl's. I must be careful to remember them and send them a kiss every day. Anne blew a couple of airy kisses from her fingertips past the cherry blossoms and then, with her chin in her hands, drifted luxuriously out on a sea of daydreams. Chapter 9. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is properly horrified. Anne had been a fortnight at Green Gables before Mrs. Lynde arrived to inspect her. Mrs. Rachel, to do her justice, was not to blame for this. A severe and unseasonable attack of grippe had confined that good lady to her house ever since the occasion of her last visit to Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel was not often sick, and had a well-defined contempt for people who were. But grippe, she asserted, was like no other illness on earth, and could only be interpreted as one of the special visitations of Providence. As soon as her doctor allowed her to put her foot out of doors, she hurried up to Green Gables, bursting with curiosity to see Matthew and Marilla's orphan, about whom all sorts of stories and suppositions had spread in Avonlea. Anne had made good use of every waking moment of that fortnight. She had already explored every tree and shrub around the place. She discovered a lane that opened below the apple orchard and ran through a wooded area. She explored it to its very end, enjoying the brook, bridges, fir trees, wild cherry arches, thick fern corners, and byways of maple and mountain ash. She had made friends with the spring down in the hollow, that wonderful, deep, clear, icy cold spring. It was set about with smooth red sandstones and rimmed in by great palm-like clumps of water fern, and beyond it was a log bridge over the brook. That bridge led Anne's dancing feet up over a wooded hill beyond, where perpetual twilight reigned under the straight, thick-growing firs and spruces. Gossamers glimmered like threads of silver among the trees, and the fir boughs and tassels seemed to utter friendly speech. All these raptured voyages of exploration were made in the odd half-hours she was allowed for play, and Anne talked Matthew and Marilla half-deaf over her discoveries. Not that Matthew complained, to be sure. He listened to it all with a wordless smile of enjoyment on his face. Marilla permitted the chatter until she found herself becoming too interested in it whereupon she always promptly quenched Anne by a curt command to hold her tongue. Anne was out in the orchard when Mrs. Rachel came, wandering at her own sweet will through the lush, tremulous grasses splashed with ruddy evening sunshine, so that the good lady had an excellent chance to talk about her illness fully, describing every ache and pulse beat with such evident enjoyment that Marilla thought even grippe must bring its compensations. When details were exhausted, Mrs. Rachel introduced the real reason for her call. "I've been hearing some surprising things about you and Matthew." "I don't suppose you are any more surprised than I am myself," said Marilla. "I'm getting over my surprise now." "It was too bad there was such a mistake," said Mrs. Rachel sympathetically. "Couldn't you have sent her back?" "I suppose we could, but we decided not to. Matthew took a fancy to her, and I must say I like her myself, although I admit she has her faults. The house seems a different place already. She's a real bright little thing." Marilla said more than she had intended to say when she began, for she read disapproval in Mrs. Rachel's expression. "It's a great responsibility you've taken on yourself," said the lady gloomily, "especially when you've never had any experience with children. You don't know much about her or her real disposition, I suppose, and there's no guessing how a child like that will turn out. But I don't want to discourage you, I'm sure, Marilla." "I'm not feeling discouraged," was Marilla's dry response. "When I make up my mind to do a thing, it stays made up. I suppose you'd like to see Anne. I'll call her in." Anne came running in presently, her face sparkling with the delight of her orchard rovings, but abashed at finding herself in the unexpected presence of a stranger. She halted confusedly inside the door. She certainly was an odd-looking little creature in the short, tight, wincey dress she had worn from the asylum, below which her thin legs seemed ungracefully long. Her freckles were more numerous and obtrusive than ever. The wind had ruffled her hatless hair into over-brilliant disorder. It had never looked redder than at that moment. "Well, they didn't pick you for your looks, that's sure and certain," was Mrs. Rachel Lynde's empathetic comment. Mrs. Rachel was one of those delightful and popular people who pride themselves on speaking their mind without fear or favor. "She's terribly skinny and homely, Marilla. Come here, child, and let me have a look at you. Did anyone ever see such freckles, and hair as red as carrots? Come here, child, I say." Anne came there, but not exactly as Mrs. Rachel expected. With one bound, she crossed the kitchen floor and stood before Mrs. Rachel, her face scarlet with anger, her lips quivering, and her whole slender form trembling from head to foot. "I hate you," she cried in a choked voice, stamping her foot on the floor. "I hate you, I hate you, I hate you," a louder stamp with each assertion of hatred. "How dare you call me skinny and ugly? How dare you say I'm freckled and red-headed? You are a rude, impolite, unfeeling woman." "Anne!" exclaimed Marilla in consternation. But Anne continued to face Mrs. Rachel undauntedly, head up, eyes blazing, hands clenched, passionate indignation exhaling from her like an atmosphere. "How dare you say such things about me? How would you like to have such things said about you? How would you like to be told that you are fat and clumsy and probably haven't a spark of imagination in you? I don't care if I do hurt your feelings by saying so. I hope I hurt them. You have hurt mine worse than they were ever hurt before, even by Mrs. Thomas's intoxicated husband. And I'll never forgive you for it. Never, never. Stamp, stamp." "Did anybody ever see such a temper?" exclaimed the horrified Mrs. Rachel. "Anne, go to your room and stay there until I come up," said Marilla, recovering her powers of speech with difficulty. Anne, bursting into tears, rushed to the hall door, slammed it until the tins on the porch wall outside rattled in sympathy, and fled through the hall and up the stairs like a whirlwind. "Well, I don't envy you your job bringing that up, Marilla," said Mrs. Rachel with unspeakable solemnity. Marilla opened her lips to say she knew not what of apology or deprecation. What she did say was a surprise to herself then and even afterwards. "You shouldn't have twitted her about her looks, Rachel." "Marilla Cuthbert, you don't mean to say that you are upholding her in such a terrible display of temper as we've just seen?" demanded Mrs. Rachel indignantly. "No," said Marilla slowly. "I'm not trying to excuse her. She's been very naughty, and I'll have to give her a talking to about it. But we must make allowances for her. She's never been taught what is right, and you were too hard on her, Rachel." Marilla could not help tacking on that last sentence, although she was again surprised at herself for doing it. Mrs. Rachel got up with an air of offended dignity. "Well, I see that I'll have to be very careful what I say after this, Marilla, since the fine feelings of orphans, brought from goodness knows where, have to be considered before anything else." "Oh, no, I'm not vexed. Don't worry yourself. I'm too sorry for you to leave any room for anger in my mind. You'll have your own troubles with that child. But if you'll like to take my advice, which I suppose you won't do, although I've brought up 10 children and buried 2, you'll do that talking to you mention with a fair-sized birch switch. I should think that would be the most effective language for that kind of child. Her temper matches her hair, I guess. Well, good evening, Marilla. I hope you'll come down to see me often as usual. But you can't expect me to visit here again in a hurry, if I'm liable to be flown at and insulted in such a fashion. It's something new in my experience." With that, Mrs. Rachel swept out and away, if a fat woman who always waddled could be said to sweep away, and Marilla, with a solemn face, betook herself to the east gable. On the way upstairs, she pondered uneasily as to what she ought to do. She felt no little dismay over the scene that had just been enacted. How unfortunate that Anne should have displayed such temper before Mrs. Rachel Lynde, of all people. Then Marilla suddenly became aware of an uncomfortable and rebuking consciousness that she felt more humiliation over this than sorrow over the discovery of such a serious defect in Anne's disposition. And how was she to punish her? The amiable suggestion of the birch switch, to the efficiency of which all of Mrs. Rachel's own children could have borne smarting testimony, did not appeal to Marilla. She did not believe she could whip a child. No, some other method of punishment must be found to bring Anne to a proper realization of the enormity of her offense. Marilla found Anne face down on her bed, crying bitterly, quite oblivious of muddy boots on a clean counterpane. "Anne," she said, not ungently. No answer. "Anne," with greater severity, "get off that bed this minute and listen to what I have to say to you." Anne squirmed off the bed and sat rigidly on a chair beside it, her face swollen and tear-stained, and her eyes fixed stubbornly on the floor. "This is a nice way for you to behave, Anne. Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" "She hadn't any right to call me ugly and red-headed," retorted Anne, evasive and defiant. "You hadn't any right to fly into such a fury and talk the way you did to her, Anne. I was ashamed of you, thoroughly ashamed of you. I wanted you to behave nicely to Mrs. Lynde, and instead of that, you've disgraced me. I'm sure I don't know why you should lose your temper like that, just because Mrs. Lynde said you were red-haired and homely. You say it yourself often enough." "Oh, but there's such a difference between saying a thing yourself and hearing other people say it," wailed Anne. You may know a thing is so, but you can't help hoping other people don't quite think it is. I suppose you think I have an awful temper, but I couldn't help it. When she said those things, something just rose right up in me and choked me. I had to fly at her. Well, you made a fine exhibition of yourself, I must say. Mrs. Lynde will have a nice story to tell about you everywhere, and she'll tell it too. It was a dreadful thing for you to lose your temper like that, Anne. Just imagine how you would feel if somebody told you to your face that you were skinny and ugly, pleaded Anne tearfully. An old remembrance suddenly rose up before Marilla. She had been a very small child when she had heard one aunt say of her to another, "What a pity she's such a dark, homely little thing." Marilla was every day of 50 before the sting had gone out of that memory. I don't say that I think Mrs. Lynde was exactly right in saying what she did to you, Anne, she admitted in a softer tone. Rachel is too outspoken, but that is no excuse for such behavior on your part. She was a stranger and an elderly person and my visitor, all 3 very good reasons why you should have been respectful to her. You were rude and saucy and— Marilla had a saving inspiration of punishment. You must go to her and tell her you are very sorry for your bad temper and ask her to forgive you. I can never do that, said Anne, determinedly and darkly. You can punish me in any way you like, Marilla. You can shut me up in a dark, damp dungeon inhabited by snakes and toads and feed me only bread and water, and I shall not complain. But I cannot ask Mrs. Lynde to forgive me. We're not in the habit of shutting people up in dark, damp dungeons, said Marilla dryly, especially as they're rare, scarce in Avonlea. But apologize to Mrs. Lynde you must and shall, and you'll stay here in your room until you can tell me you're willing to do it. I shall have to stay here forever then, said Anne mournfully, because I can't tell Mrs. Lynde I'm sorry I said those things to her. How can I? I'm not sorry. I'm sorry I vexed you, but I'm glad I told her just what I did. It was a great satisfaction. I can't say I'm sorry when I'm not, can I? I can't even imagine I'm sorry. Perhaps your imagination will be in better working order by the morning, said Marilla, rising to depart. You'll have the night to think over your conduct and come to a better frame of mind. You said you would try to be a very good girl if we kept you at Green Gables, but I must say it hasn't seemed very much like it this evening. Leaving this final remark to stir up Anne's emotions, Marilla went down to the kitchen, deeply troubled and upset. She was as angry with herself as with Anne, because whenever she recalled Mrs. Rachel's dumbfounded countenance, her lips twitched with amusement, and she felt a most reprehensible desire to laugh. Chapter 10. Anne's Apology. Marilla said nothing to Matthew about the incident that evening, but when Anne remained defiant the next morning, she had to explain why Anne was absent from the breakfast table. Marilla told Matthew the whole story, emphasizing how serious Anne's behavior had been. It's a good thing Rachel Lynde got a telling off. She's a meddlesome old gossip, Matthew replied consolingly. Matthew Cuthbert, I'm astonished at you. You know Anne's behavior was dreadful, yet you take her side. I suppose you'll say next that she shouldn't be punished at all. Well now, no, not exactly, said Matthew uneasily. I reckon she should be punished a little, but don't be too hard on her, Marilla. She's never had anyone to teach her right. You're going to give her something to eat, aren't you? When did you ever hear of me starving people into good behavior? Demanded Marilla indignantly. She'll have her meals regularly, and I'll take them up to her myself. But she'll stay up there until she's willing to apologize to Mrs. Lynde, and that's final, Matthew. Breakfast, dinner, and supper were very silent meals, as Anne still remained stubborn. After each meal, Marilla carried a well-filled tray to the east gable and brought it down later on, not noticeably depleted. Matthew eyed its last descent with a troubled look. Had Anne eaten anything at all? When Marilla went out that evening to bring the cows from the back pasture, Matthew, who had been hanging around the barns and watching, slipped into the house with the air of a burglar and crept upstairs. Matthew usually stayed between the kitchen and his little bedroom off the hall where he slept. Once in a while, he ventured uncomfortably into the parlor or sitting room when the minister came to tea, but he had never been upstairs in his own house since the spring he helped Marilla paper the spare bedroom, and that was 4 years ago. He tiptoed along the hall and stood for several minutes outside the door of the east gable before he gathered the courage to tap on it with his fingers, and then opened the door to peek in. Anne was sitting on the yellow chair by the window, gazing mournfully into the garden. She looked very small and unhappy, and Matthew's heart ached for her. He softly closed the door and tiptoed over to her. "Anne," he whispered, as if afraid of being overheard. "How are you doing, Anne?" Anne smiled faintly. "Pretty well. I imagine a lot, and that helps pass the time. Of course it's rather lonely, but then I might as well get used to that." Anne smiled again, bravely facing the long years of solitary confinement ahead of her. Matthew remembered he needed to say what he had come to say quickly, lest Marilla return prematurely. "Well now, Anne, don't you think you'd better do it and get it over with?" he whispered. "It'll have to be done sooner or later, you know, for Marilla's a very determined woman. Very determined, Anne. Do it right away, I say, and get it over with." "Do you mean apologize to Mrs. Lynde?" "Yes, apologize. That's the very word," said Matthew eagerly. "Just smooth things over, so to speak. That's what I was trying to get at." "I suppose I could do it to oblige you," said Anne thoughtfully. "It would be true enough to say I am sorry, because I am sorry now. I wasn't a bit sorry last night. I was mad all through, and I stayed mad all night. I know I did, because I woke up 3 times, and I was just furious each time. But this morning it was over. I wasn't angry anymore, and it left a dreadful sort of emptiness, too. I felt so ashamed of myself, but I just couldn't think of going and telling Mrs. Lynde so. It would be so humiliating. I made up my mind I'd stay shut up here forever rather than do that. But still, I'd do anything for you if you really wanted me to." "Well now, of course I do. It's terribly lonely downstairs without you. Just go and smooth things over. That's a good girl." "Very well," said Anne resignedly. "I'll tell Marilla as soon as she comes in that I've repented." That's right, Anne. But don't tell Marilla I said anything about it. She might think I was interfering, and I promise not to do that." "Wild horses won't drag the secret from me," promised Anne solemnly. How would wild horses drag a secret from a person anyhow? But Matthew was already gone, scared at his own success. He fled hastily to the remotest corner of the horse pasture, lest Marilla should suspect what he had been up to. Marilla herself, upon return to the house, was agreeably surprised to hear a plaintive voice calling, "Marilla," over the banister. "Well," she said, going into the hall, "I'm sorry I lost my temper and said rude things, and I'm willing to go and tell Mrs. Lynde so." "Very well." Marilla's crispness gave no sign of her relief. She had been wondering what she would do if Anne did not give in, I'll take you down after milking." Accordingly, after milking, behold Marilla and Anne walking down the lane, the former erect and triumphant, the latter drooping and dejected. But halfway down, Anne's dejection vanished as if by magic. She lifted her head and stepped lightly along, her eyes fixed on the sunset sky and an air of subdued excitement about her. Marilla beheld the change disapprovingly. This was not the meek penitent she intended to present to the offended Mrs. Lynde. "What are you thinking of, Anne?" "I'm imagining what I must say to Mrs. Lynde," answered Anne dreamily. That was satisfactory, or should have been, but Marilla could not rid herself of the notion that something in her punishment scheme was going awry. Anne had no business looking so rapt and radiant. Rapt and radiant Anne remained until they stood before Mrs. Lynde, who was sitting and knitting by her kitchen window. Then the radiance vanished. Mournful penitence appeared on every feature. Before a word was spoken, Anne suddenly went down on her knees before the astonished Mrs. Rachel and held out her hands beseechingly. "Oh, Mrs. Lynde, I am so extremely sorry," she said with a quiver in her voice. "I can never express all my sorrow. No, not if I used up a whole dictionary. You must just imagine it. I behaved terribly to you, and I've disgraced the dear friends Matthew and Marilla, who have left me to stay at Green Gables, although I'm not a boy. I'm a dreadfully wicked and ungrateful girl, and I deserve to be punished and cast out by respectable people forever. It was very wicked of me to fly into a temper because you told me the truth. It was the truth. Every word you said was true. My hair is red and I'm freckled and skinny and ugly. What I said to you was true too, but I shouldn't have said it. Oh, Mrs. Lynde, please, please forgive me. If you refuse it, it will be a lifelong sorrow for a poor little orphan girl. Would you, even if she had a dreadful temper? Oh, I'm sure you wouldn't. Please say you forgive me, Mrs. Lynde." Anne clasped her hands together, bowed her head, and waited for the word of judgment. There was no mistaking her sincerity. It was in every tone of her voice. Both Marilla and Mrs. Lynde recognized it, but Marilla understood with dismay that Anne was actually enjoying her humiliation. Where was the wholesome punishment Marilla had intended? Anne had turned it into a form of positive pleasure. Good Mrs. Lynde, not being very perceptive, did not see this. She only saw that Anne had made a very thorough apology, and all resentment vanished from her kind, if somewhat officious heart. There, get up, child," she said heartily. "Of course I forgive you. I guess I was a little too hard on you anyway, but I'm such an outspoken person. You just mustn't mind me, that's all. It can't be denied your hair is terribly red, but I knew a girl once, went to school with her, in fact, whose hair was every bit as red as yours when she was young. But when she grew up, it darkened to a real handsome auburn. I wouldn't be surprised if yours did too, not a bit." "Oh, Mrs. Lynde," Anne drew a long breath as she rose to her feet. "You've given me hope. I shall always feel that you are a benefactor. Oh, I could endure anything if I only thought my hair would be a handsome auburn when I grow up. It would be so much easier to be good if one's hair was a handsome auburn, don't you think? And now, may I go out into your garden and sit on that bench under the apple trees while you and Marilla are talking? There's so much more room for imagination out there." "Yes, run along, child, and you can pick a bouquet of those white June lilies over in the corner if you like." As the door closed behind Anne, Mrs. Lynde got briskly up to light a lamp. "She's a real odd little thing. Take this chair, Marilla. It's easier than the one you've got. I just keep that for the hired boy to sit on. Yes, she certainly is an odd child, but there's something kind of appealing about her after all. I don't feel so surprised at you and Matthew keeping her as I did, nor so sorry for you either. She may turn out all right. Of course, she has a strange way of expressing herself, a little too kind of forceful, you know. But she'll likely get over that now that she's come to live among civilized folks. And then her temper's pretty quick, I guess. But there's one comfort. A child with a quick temper who just blazes up and cools down isn't likely to be sly or deceitful. Preserve me from a sly child, that's what. On the whole, Marilla, I kind of like her. When Marilla went home, Anne came out of the fragrant twilight of the orchard with a bunch of white narcissi in her hands. I apologized pretty well, didn't I? She said proudly as they walked down the lane. I thought since I had to do it, I might as well do it thoroughly. You did it thoroughly, all right, was Marilla's comment. Marilla was dismayed at finding herself inclined to laugh at the recollection. She also felt uneasy, thinking she ought to scold Anne for apologizing so well. But then that was ridiculous. She compromised with her conscience by saying severely, I hope you won't have to make many more such apologies. I hope you'll try to control your temper now, Anne. That wouldn't be so hard if people wouldn't tease me about my looks, said Anne with a sigh. I don't get cross about other things, but I'm so tired of being teased about my hair, and it just makes me boil over. Do you think my hair will really be handsome auburn when I grow up? You shouldn't think so much about your looks, Anne. I'm afraid you're a very vain little girl. How can I be vain when I know I'm homely? Protested Anne. I love pretty things, and I hate to look in the mirror and see something that isn't pretty. It makes me feel so sad, just as I feel when I look at anything ugly. I pity it because it isn't beautiful. Handsome is as handsome does, quoted Marilla. I've heard that said before, but I have my doubts about it, remarked skeptical Anne. Oh, aren't these flowers sweet? It was lovely of Mrs. Lynde to give them to me. I have no hard feelings against Mrs. Lynde now. It gives you a lovely, comfortable feeling to apologize and be forgiven, doesn't it? Aren't the stars bright tonight? If you could live in a star, which one would you pick? I'd like that lovely, clear big one over there above the dark hill. Anne, do hold your tongue, said Marilla, thoroughly worn out trying to follow the twists and turns of Anne's thoughts. Anne said no more until they turned into their own lane. A little gypsy wind came down to meet them, laden with the spicy perfume of young dew-wet ferns. Far up in the shadows, a cheerful light gleamed out through the trees from the kitchen at Green Gables. Anne suddenly came close to Marilla and slipped her hand into the older woman's firm grip. It's lovely to be going home and know it's home, she said. I love Green Gables already, and I never loved any place before. No place ever seemed like home. Oh, Marilla, I'm so happy. I could pray right now and not find it hard at all. Something warm and pleasant welled up in Marilla's heart at the touch of that thin little hand in her own. A throb of motherhood she had missed, perhaps. Its very unaccustomedness and sweetness disturbed her. She hastened to restore her feelings to their normal calm by imparting a moral. If you'll be a good girl, you'll always be happy, Anne, and you should never find it hard to say your prayers. Saying one's prayers isn't exactly the same thing as praying, said Anne thoughtfully. But I'm going to imagine that I'm the wind blowing up there in those treetops. When I get tired of the trees, I'll imagine I'm gently waving down here in the ferns, and then I'll fly over to Mrs. Lynde's garden and set the flowers dancing, and then I'll go with one great swoop over the clover field, and then I'll blow over the lake of shining waters and ripple it up into little sparkling waves. Oh, there's so much room for imagination in a wind, so I'll not talk any more just now, Marilla." "Thank goodness for that," breathed Marilla in devout relief. Chapter 11. Anne's Impressions of Sunday School. "Well, how do you like them?" asked Marilla. Anne was standing in the gable room, looking solemnly at 3 new dresses spread out on the bed. One was a snuffy-colored gingham that Marilla had bought from a peddler the previous summer because it looked durable. Another was a black and white checkered sateen she had found on a bargain counter in the winter. The third was a stiff print of an ugly blue shade she had purchased that week at a store in Carmody. She had made them herself, and they were all the same. Plain skirts gathered tightly to plain waists, with sleeves as plain as the waists and skirts, and as tight as the sleeves could be. "I'll imagine that I'll like them," said Anne soberly. "I don't want you to imagine it," said Marilla, offended. "Oh, I can see you don't like the dresses. What's wrong with them? Aren't they neat and clean and new?" "Yes. Then why don't you like them?" They're not pretty," said Anne reluctantly. "Pretty?" Marilla sniffed. "I didn't worry about getting pretty dresses for you. I don't believe in pampering vanity, Anne. I'll tell you that right off. These dresses are good, sensible, and practical, without any frills or decorations, and they're all you'll get this summer. The brown gingham and the blue print will do for school when you start. The sateen is for church and Sunday school. I expect you to keep them neat and clean and not tear them. I'd think you'd be grateful to get anything after those skimpy, wincey things you've been wearing." "Oh, I am grateful," protested Anne, "but I'd be ever so much more grateful if you'd made just one of them with puffed sleeves. Puffed sleeves are so fashionable now. It would give me such a thrill, Marilla, just to wear a dress with puffed sleeves." "Well, you'll have to do without your thrill. I didn't have any extra material for puffed sleeves. I think they look ridiculous anyway. I prefer plain, sensible ones. But I'd rather look ridiculous when everybody else does than plain and sensible all by myself," persisted Anne mournfully. "Trust you for that. Well, hang those dresses carefully in your closet, then sit down and learn the Sunday school lesson. I got a quarterly from Mr. Bell for you, and you'll go to Sunday school tomorrow," said Marilla, disappearing downstairs in high dudgeon. Anne clasped her hands and looked at the dresses. "I did hope there would be a white one with puffed sleeves," she whispered disconsolately. "I prayed for one, but I didn't really expect it. I didn't think God would bother about a little orphan girl's dress. I knew I'd have to depend on Marilla for it. Well, fortunately, I can imagine that one of them is snow-white muslin with lovely lace frills and 3 puffed sleeves." The next morning, warnings of a sick headache prevented Marilla from going to Sunday school with Anne. "You'll have to go down and call for Mrs. Lynde, Anne," she said. "She'll see that you get into the right class. Now, mind you, behave yourself properly. Stay for the sermon afterward and ask Mrs. Lynde to show you our pew. Here's a cent for the collection. Don't stare at people and don't fidget. I expect you to tell me the text when you come home." Anne started off, impeccable in the stiff black and white sateen, which, while decent in length and not too skimpy, managed to highlight every corner and angle of her thin figure. Her hat was a little flat, glossy, new sailor whose extreme plainness had likewise disappointed Anne, who had dreamed of ribbons and flowers. However, she remedied that before reaching the main road by adorning her hat with a heavy wreath of buttercups and wild roses. Whatever others might have thought of the result, it satisfied Anne, and she tripped gaily down the road, holding her decorated head proudly. When she reached Mrs. Lynde's house, she found that the lady had already left. Undaunted, Anne proceeded to the church alone. In the porch, she found a crowd of little girls, all more or less gaily dressed in whites, blues, and pinks, and all staring curiously at the stranger in their midst, with her extraordinary head adornment. Avonlea little girls had already heard strange stories about Anne. Mrs. Lynde said she had an awful temper. Jerry Buatté, the hired boy at Green Gables, said she talked to herself or to the trees and flowers like a crazy girl. They looked at her and whispered to each other behind their quarterlies. Nobody made any friendly advances, then or later, when the opening exercises were over and Anne found herself in Miss Rogerson's class. Miss Rogerson was a middle-aged lady who had taught a Sunday school class for 20 years. Her method was to ask the printed questions from the quarterly and looked sternly over its edge at the particular little girl she thought should answer. She looked often at Anne, and Anne, thanks to Marilla's drilling, answered promptly. But it's questionable if she understood much about either question or answer. She did not think she liked Miss Rogerson, and she felt very miserable. Every other little girl in the class had puffed sleeves. Anne felt that life was really not worth living without puffed sleeves. "Well, how did you like Sunday school?" Marilla wanted to know when Anne came home. Her wreath had faded, so Anne had discarded it in the lane, sparing Marilla the sight. "I didn't like it a bit. It was horrid." "Anne Shirley," said Marilla rebukingly. Anne sat down on the rocker with a long sigh, kissed one of Bonnie's leaves, and waved her hand to a blooming fuchsia. "They might have been lonely while I was away," she explained. "And now, about the Sunday school. I behaved well, just as you told me. Mrs. Lynde was gone, but I went right on myself. I went into the church with a lot of other little girls, and I sat in the corner of a pew by the window during the opening exercises. Mr. Bell made an awfully long prayer. I would have been dreadfully tired if I hadn't been sitting by that window, but it looked right out on the lake of shining waters, so I just gazed at that and imagined all sorts of splendid things." "You shouldn't have done that. You should have listened to Mr. Bell." "But he wasn't talking to me," protested Anne. "He was talking to God, and he didn't seem very interested in it either. I think he thought God was too far away." There was a long row of white birches hanging over the lake, and the sunshine fell down through them, way, way down, deep into the water. "Oh, Marilla, it was like a beautiful dream. It gave me a thrill, and I just said, 'Thank you for it, God,' 2 or 3 times. "Not out loud, I hope," said Marilla anxiously. "Oh, no, just under my breath." Well, Mr. Bell did finish at last, and they told me to go into the classroom with Miss Rogerson's class. There were 9 other girls in it. They all had puffed sleeves. I tried to imagine mine were puffed too, but I couldn't. Why couldn't I? It was as easy as could be to imagine they were puffed when I was alone in the east gable, but it was awfully hard there among the others who had real puffs. "You shouldn't have been thinking about your sleeves in Sunday school. You should have been paying attention to the lesson. I hope you knew it." "Oh, yes, and I answered a lot of questions." Miss Rogerson asked ever so many. I don't think it was fair for her to do all the asking. There were lots I wanted to ask her, but I didn't like to because I didn't think she was a kindred spirit. Then all the other little girls recited a paraphrase. She asked me if I knew any. I told her I didn't, but I could recite "The Dog at His Master's Grave" if she liked. That's in the Third Royal Reader. It isn't a religious piece of poetry, but it's so sad and melancholy that it might as well be. She said it wouldn't do, and told me to learn the 19th paraphrase for next Sunday. I read it over in church afterward, and it's splendid. There are 2 lines in particular that just thrill me. Quick as the slaughtered squadrons fell in Midian's evil day. I don't know what squadrons means, nor Midian either, but it sounds so tragic. I can hardly wait until next Sunday to recite it. I'll practice it all week. After Sunday school, I asked Miss Rogerson, because Mrs. Lynde was too far away, to show me your pew. I sat as still as I could, and the text was Revelation, 3rd chapter, 2nd and 3rd verses. It was a very long text. If I were a minister, I'd pick the short, snappy ones. The sermon was awfully long, too. I suppose the minister had to match it to the text. I didn't think he was interesting. The trouble with him seems to be that he doesn't have enough imagination. I didn't listen to him very much. I just let my thoughts wander, and I thought of the most surprising things. Marilla felt hopelessly that all this should be sternly reproved, but she was hindered by the undeniable fact that some of the things Anne had said, especially about the minister's sermons and Mr. Bell's prayers, were what she herself had really thought deep down in her heart for years, but had never expressed. It felt to her as if those secret, unspoken, critical thoughts had suddenly come to life and were now accusing her through this outspoken, neglected child. Chapter 12. A Solemn Vow and Promise. It wasn't until the following Friday that Marilla heard about the flower-wreathed hat. She came home from Mrs. Lynde's and called Anne to account. "Anne, Mrs. Rachel says you went to church last Sunday with your hat decorated with roses and buttercups. What on earth made you do that? You must have looked ridiculous." "Oh, I know pink and yellow aren't becoming to me," began Anne. "Becoming fiddlesticks! It was putting flowers on your hat at all, no matter what color. That was ridiculous. You are the most aggravating child." "I don't see why it's any more ridiculous to wear flowers on your hat than on your dress," protested Anne. "Lots of little girls had bouquets pinned on their dresses. What's the difference?" Marilla was not about to be swayed by this argument. "Don't talk back to me, Anne. It was very silly of you to do such a thing. Never let me catch you doing that again. Mrs. Rachel says she thought she would sink through the floor when she saw you come in looking like that. She couldn't get near enough to tell you to take them off until it was too late. She says people talked about it terribly. Of course they would think I had no better sense than to let you go decked out like that." "Oh, I'm so sorry," said Anne, tears welling up in her eyes. "I never thought you'd mind. The roses and buttercups were so sweet and pretty. I thought they'd look lovely on my hat. Lots of the little girls had artificial flowers on their hats. I'm afraid I'm going to be a dreadful trial to you. Maybe you'd better send me back to the asylum." "That would be terrible. I don't think I could endure it. I'm so thin as it is, you see. But that would be better than being a trial to you." "Nonsense," said Marilla, annoyed at herself for making the child cry. "I don't want to send you back to the asylum. All I want is for you to behave like the other little girls and not make yourself ridiculous. Don't cry any more. I've got some news for you. Diana Barry came home this afternoon. I'm going up to see if I can borrow a skirt pattern from Mrs. Barry, and if you like, you can come with me and get acquainted with Diana." Anne rose to her feet, clasped her hands, and the tears still glistened on her cheeks. The dish towel she had been hemming slipped unheeded to the floor. "Oh, Marilla, I'm frightened. Now that it has come, I'm actually frightened. What if she doesn't like me? It would be the most tragic disappointment of my life." "Now, don't get all flustered, and I do wish you wouldn't use such long words. It sounds so funny in a little girl. Diana will like you well enough. It's her mother you have to worry about. If she doesn't like you, it won't matter how much Diana does. If she has heard about your outburst to Mrs. Lynde and going to church with buttercups on your hat, I don't know what she'll think of you. You must be polite and well-behaved, and don't make any startling speeches. For heaven's sake, if the child isn't actually trembling." Anne was trembling. Her face was pale and tense. "Oh, Marilla, you'd be excited too if you were going to meet a little girl you hoped to be your best friend and whose mother might not like you," she said as she hurried to get her hat. They went over to Orchard Slope by the short cut across the brook and up the fir-covered hill. Mrs. Barry came to the kitchen door in answer to Marilla's knock. She was a tall, black-eyed, black-haired woman with a very determined mouth. She had a reputation for being very strict with her children. "How do you do, Marilla?" she said cordially. "Come in. And this is the little girl you've adopted, I suppose?" "Yes, this is Anne Shirley," said Marilla. "Spelled with an E," gasped Anne, who, despite her nervousness, was determined there should be no misunderstanding on that important point. Mrs. Barry, not hearing nor comprehending, merely shook hands and said kindly, "How are you?" "I am well in body, although considerably ruffled in spirit, thank you, ma'am," said Anne gravely. Then, aside to Marilla in an audible whisper, "There wasn't anything startling in that, was there, Marilla?" Diana was sitting on the sofa, reading a book which she dropped when the callers entered. She was a very pretty little girl, with her mother's black eyes and hair, rosy cheeks, and the merry expression which was her inheritance from her father. "This is my little girl Diana," said Mrs. Barry. "Diana, you might take Anne out into the garden and show her your flowers. It will be better for you than straining your eyes over that book. She reads entirely too much," she added to Marilla as the girls went out, "and I can't prevent her, for her father encourages her. She's always poring over a book. I'm glad she has the prospect of a playmate. Perhaps it will get her outside more." Outside in the garden, which was full of mellow sunset light streaming through the dark old firs to the west, stood Anne and Diana, gazing bashfully at each other over a clump of gorgeous tiger lilies. The Barry garden was a riot of flowers which would have delighted Anne's heart at any other time. It was surrounded by huge old willows and tall firs, under which flourished flowers that loved the shade. Prim, right-angled paths, neatly bordered with clamshells, intersected it like moist ribbons, and in the beds between, old-fashioned flowers ran riot. There were rosy bleeding hearts and large, vibrant crimson peonies, thorny sweet Scotch roses, pink, blue, and white columbines, and lilac-tinted bouncing bets, clusters of southernwood, ribbon grass, and mint, purple Adam and Eve, daffodils, and masses of sweet clover, white with delicate, fragrant feathery sprays, scarlet lightning that shot its fiery lances over neat white musk flowers, a garden where sunshine lingered, bees hummed, and winds tempted to stay purred and rustled. "Oh, Diana," said Anne at last, clasping her hands and speaking almost in a whisper. "Oh, do you think you can like me a little, enough to be my best friend?" Diana laughed. Diane always laughed before she spoke. "Why, I guess so," she said frankly. "I'm really glad you've come to live at Green Gables. It will be fun to have someone to play with. There isn't any other girl who lives near enough to play with, and I've no sisters big enough." "Will you swear to be my friend forever and ever?" demanded Anne eagerly. Diane looked shocked. "Why, it's dreadfully wicked to swear." "Oh no, not my kind of swearing. There are two kinds, you know." "I've never heard of but one kind," said Diana doubtfully. "There really is another. Oh, it isn't wicked at all. It just means vowing and promising solemnly." "Well, I don't mind doing that," agreed Diana, relieved. "How do you do it?" "We must join hands like this," said Anne gravely. "It ought to be over running water. We'll just imagine this path is running water. I'll repeat the oath first. I solemnly swear to be faithful to my best friend Diana Barry, as long as the sun and moon shall endure. Now you say it and put my name in it." Diana repeated the oath with a laugh before and after. Then she said, "You're a queer girl, Anne. I heard before that you were strange, but I believe I'm going to like you a lot." When Marilla and Anne went home, Diana went with them as far as the log bridge. The two little girls walked with their arms around each other. At the brook, they parted with many promises to spend the next afternoon together. "Well, did you find Diana a kindred spirit?" asked Marilla as they walked up through the garden of Green Gables. "Oh, yes," sighed Anne, blissfully unaware of any sarcasm in Marilla's question. "Oh, Marilla, I'm the happiest girl on Prince Edward Island right now. I assure you I'll say my prayers with real enthusiasm tonight. Diana and I are going to build a playhouse in Mr. William Bell's birch grove tomorrow. Can I have those broken pieces of china that are out in the woodshed? Diana's birthday's in February, and mine's in March. Don't you think that is a very strange coincidence? Diana's going to lend me a book to read. She says it's perfectly splendid and tremendously exciting. She's going to show me a place back in the woods where rice lilies grow. Don't you think Diana has very soulful eyes? I wish I had soulful eyes. Diana's going to teach me to sing a song called Nellie in the Hazel Dell. She's going to give me a picture to put up in my room. It's a beautiful picture, she says. A lovely lady in a pale blue silk dress. A sewing machine agent gave it to her. I wish I had something to give Diana. I'm an inch taller than Diana, but she is ever so much fatter. She says she'd like to be thin because it's so much more graceful, but I'm afraid she only said it to make me feel better. We're going to the shore some day to gather shells. We have agreed to call the spring down by the log bridge the Dryad's Bubble. Isn't that a perfectly elegant name? I read a story once about a spring called that. A dryad is a sort of grown-up fairy, I think. Well, all I hope is you won't talk Diana to death, said Marilla. But remember, this in all your planning, Anne. You're not going to play all the time, nor most of it. You'll have your work to do, and it'll have to be done first. Anne's cup of happiness was full, and Matthew made it overflow. He had just gotten home from a trip to the store at Carmody, and he sheepishly produced a small parcel from his pocket and handed it to Anne with an apologetic look at Marilla. I heard you say you like chocolate sweets, so I got you some, he said. Sniffed Marilla. It'll ruin her teeth and stomach. There, child, don't look so dismal. You can eat those, since Matthew has gone and gotten them. He'd better have brought you peppermints. They're healthier. Don't make yourself sick eating all of them at once." "Oh, no, indeed I won't," said Anne eagerly. "I'll just eat one tonight, Marilla. And I can give Diana half of them, can't I? The other half will taste twice as sweet to me if I give some to her. It's delightful to think I have something to give her." "I will say this for the child," said Marilla, when Anne had gone to her room. "She isn't stingy. I'm glad, because of all faults, I detest stinginess in a child. Dear me, it's only been 3 weeks since she came, and it seemed as if she'd been here always. I can't imagine the place without her. Now, don't be looking 'I told you so,' Matthew. That's bad enough in a woman, but it isn't to be endured in a man. I'm perfectly willing to admit that I'm glad I agreed to keep the child, and that I am getting fond of her. But don't rub it in, Matthew Cuthbert." Sweet dreams, my friend. Sleep well.